Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Became the Hero, Akatani Mikumo? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Akatani Mikumo honestly had to have the worst luck. A jog. Just one little run, nothing could happen, right? Naturally, he runs headlong into a bunch of creepy catcallers. The girl couldn't have been much older than him, pedophiles. And of course said catcallers had to have the most sensitive egos and nice powerful quirks to match. Of course. So there he was. Once it had become apparent they were actually looking to fight, he'd only called them scum. It was true, so he didn't see why they'd get so angry. He'd grabbed the girl's hand and hightailed it away, aiming for a more crowded street to lose their pursuers. He could hear the cat-calling assholes running after them, cussing both of them out, which didn't really make sense since the girl hadn't done anything, and ducked into a bookshop as a group of people passed by. Tugging the girl behind a shelf, he listened through the door as the cussing faded once the men ran past. Breathing out a sigh of relief, he turned to the girl, jumping as he realized she was staring at him. Oh dear. He flushed as he realized he'd basically kidnapped a random girl. Sorry for, grabbing you like that, but they looked ready to fight and I really didn't feel like it'd be right to leave you there with them, especially since they were harassing you, which is very uncool, but I'll go now if you want. Please don't call the cops on me, I just wanted to go on a morning go. Are you? The girl cut him off by patting his shoulder awkwardly. I didn't get most of that, but please, there's no need to apologize when you actually helped. I wasn't sure what to do then, so thank you for intervening. Oh my god, I didn't introduce myself, he muttered to himself in horror. Akatani Mikumo. Call me Akatani, Yaoyorozu Momo. Call me Akatani, Yaoyorozu-san. Yes, thank you for intervening, Akatani-san. Oh, it's no problem really. If anything, I'm glad to help. What kind of wannabe hero lets guys harass girls like that? Yaoyorozu's eyes lit up. You want to be a hero? Akatani felt his face heat up at the mention of his dream. Even after training with all might, he still wasn't sure people wouldn't laugh, that this wasn't just a dream and he'd wake up at any moment, back with. Cutting off that line of thought before it spiraled out of control, he nodded cautiously, looking away. He didn't want to see the doubt on her face, the contempt, the disgust. Me too. There it was. Akatani's head snapped up so fast he might have gotten whiplash. Yaoyorozu blushed lightly, and he realized how it must have looked without hearing his inner monologue. I mean, she started. Really? Do you plan on going to UA, too? She blinked, then beamed. Well, yes, actually. Akatani grinned at her in delight. Let's get in together. Oi, if you two don't quiet down, we'll have to kick you out. The shopkeeper interrupted, and this time, both of them blushed, stammering apologies before leaving in a rush, much to the relief of the customers. So, Yaoyorozu-san, what were you doing out? I mean, before those guys showed up? Akatani asked. Yaoyorozu blinked. Then panicked. Oh no, I completely forgot. I was meant to wait for my mother. Entrance exams are today. Entrance exams? Like, the UA recommendation exam. Yaoyorozu pauses in her panicking. Yes? Is your mom dropping you off? Yes, she had a meeting before and decided she'd drop me off afterwards, so she left me in the plaza to shop and get breakfast, but now. The recommendation exams happen at UA, right? Yes. I can get you there now, but it might be a bit disorienting. Also, you might want to tell your mom. Oh. Thank you, Akatani-san, but how? You might want to brace yourself. He cautioned, then, holding Yaoyorozu's hand, ran into the wall of the alley between the bookshop and a little cafe. Or, more specifically, the shadow on the wall. A cold feeling overtook the duo for a moment, along with an overwhelming darkness and the feeling of being pulled at from every angle by a strong wind, and then it was over, and they stood in the shadow of the gates of UA. Yaoyorozu stumbled for a second in disorientation before straightening and looking around in awe. The whole process has taken less than 3 seconds. Akatani shook his head to get rid of the fatigue creeping up on him, and weakly did jazz hands towards the school. Tadeya, he said, slightly winded. One human taxi ride, free of charge. Is that your quirk? Teleportation? In part I guess so? Yaoyorozu had literal stars on her eyes. Amazing! A rare and versatile quirk. You'll make an amazing hero, no doubt. She was practically bouncing. Shouldn't you hurry to the exam? Akatani stuttered, absolutely thrown off by the praise. Yaoyorozu, bless her, immediately dashed off at the reminder, making him give her his number first so they could share their results later. Maybe his luck wasn't horrible if he'd gotten a, maybe, possible, friend out of it. Is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to. After dropping off Yaoyorozu, Akatani chose to jog home. Well, jog was a stretch, more like a speed walk from UA to finish his workout. No excuses for slacking here. Home was a warehouse nestled cozily on the border of Mizudafu's red light district, abandoned years ago. When Akatani moved in, he managed to acquire a generator and makeshift heater from the Dagoba trash beach. Not so trash-covered now, but the sentiment still stands. The beach wasn't completely clean, but it could no longer be described as an absolute dump. Speaking of, he was meeting his mentor to continue cleaning it up. It was about noon now, so he plopped back onto his bed, a mattress with a sheet draped over it, and sighed. He still wasn't sure All Might has made the right choice. After all, how could someone like him be a hero? Much less, a hero to succeed the number one hero? Rolling off the mattress, Akatani picked up one of his knives. While he has his quirk, he didn't want to rely solely on it, nor one for all when he received it. He also didn't want to put his skills to waste even if he hated where he'd learned them. He couldn't deny they were useful skills to have, though he'd give up any skill if it meant he'd never met the wyverns. Stop moping, dumbass, I brought Katsudon. Akatani's head snapped up, gold eyes falling on his crispy companion, who he hadn't even noticed coming in. Katsudon? He looked at the older boy, squinting at the bag in his hand. Dabi gasped in mock offense. What? No greeting? Brat, I should have known you only wanted me for my wealth. Akatani sent him an unimpressed look. You're broke. He deadpanned. Well then, I see this is a day full of betrayal all around. Dabi responded, pouting yes. It was a pout, unmistakably, and leaning back. In fact, I should just keep this all for myself if this is how ungrateful you are. No, Akatani gasped in horror. Dabi huffed out a laugh at the comical expression he had on, tossing him the bag of food. Brat. 20 minutes later, with full stomachs and considerably better moods, the two were sprawled on the beanbags Dabi had brought after his first visit to the warehouse, claiming it was pitiful, and he was really only improving the place. He wasn't wrong. While Akatani had cleaned it up and made it inhabitable, Dabi was the one who'd made it comfortable. He was the one who'd taught Akatani what comfort was. Akatani turned to Dabi then, as the latter amused himself by balancing a chopstick on the underside of his nose as he sat upside down on the faded black bean bag. What brings you here? I know you don't normally visit more than a few times a week. Dabi looked over, dropping the chopstick, and huffed an almost laugh. Never let anything past you, do you? He murmured to himself, then to Akatani, said, Look, kid, you're going for you, right? Though the question was more of a statement, he nodded. Well, rumor is there's something going on. Apparently, some villain is talking big about some kind of attack on UA. Attack? Akatani echoed, and Dabi nodded. Yeah. Not too sure how credible that is. Figured you ought to hear it instead of being completely blindsided if it actually happens. Akatani nods slowly. Thanks, Dabi. He paused for a second. Do we know any specifics? Nah, but I'll tell you if anything comes up. I could always ask around as Hikage. Nope. Not doing that. I've grounded you from the underground, remember? But Dabi. Nope. You pick a fight with Yakuza, you bear the consequences. Akatani pouted, then slowly grinned. Dabi quirked an eyebrow. Do you care? He asked with a sheet-eating grin. Dabi scrunched his nose in disgust, as though the mere mention of feelings offended his delicate sensibilities. Ugh, feelings. Disgusting. Akatani grinned wider. You do. he yelped as Dabi kicked him in the side from his spot upside down. It wasn't a hard kick, as Dabi was neither wearing shoes nor trying to hurt him, but dramatics were the foundation of this friendship. Plus, it was the sentiment that mattered. Dabi made an indignant noise as a throw pillow, embroidered with "if endeavor," in bold red letters, courtesy of Dabi himself, smacked him in the face, and from then it was war. A couple hours later, if All Might noticed the feathers nestled in his young successor's dark hair, he made no mention of it. It didn't matter either way. Entrance exams were coming up soon. There were more important things to worry about. Chapter text. Akatani was nervous, to say the least. This morning, just a couple hours ago really, he'd received one for all. Hair did not go down easily, and he could practically hear Dabi's laughter, and he felt really, really queasy. It didn't help that All Might mentioned backlash, and immediately reminded Akatani of the man's words 10 months ago, "Limbs will explode." Was he about to lose his limbs? He shook his head to get rid of those thoughts. Worst case scenario, he embarrassed himself horribly and ended up a limbless torso. Not bad. As he turned the corner, the looming building that was UA came into view. Though he'd seen it dozens of times, it didn't make it any less impressive. He could see hero student hopefuls all over, walking through the massive gates, and a few actual heroes, probably to regulate the activity, as the school was open with no ID system up to make the flow of students faster. It'd be prime time for someone to sneak in, blending in with the soon-to-graduate middle schoolers. Someone like no, positive thoughts only, he reminded himself as he walked through the massive gates. Akatani let out a squeak as his foot caught on the ground, sending him falling forward. Well, guess I'll just die. He waited for the ground to meet him, and waited, and waited, and realized he was floating. Somehow. He rotated in the air to see a brunette with pink cheeks, just catching sight of her hands as she brought them together, returning his gravity. She spoke then, rubbing the back of her neck. Sorry for using my quirk on you, but it'd be bad luck if you fell, right? Anyway, good luck in the exams. See you. And she was gone. Akatani blinked after her before realizing he should probably go now, and hurrying inside. The written exam was pretty easy, though a few questions he could tell weren't actually expected to be answered perfectly. He tried his best, finishing half an hour early. He hadn't been sure how far along in education he was supposed to be, as he hadn't gone to school, well, ever, but he figured he could just ask Dabi, who sent him the flattest look, asking if he looked like someone who'd finished school. In the end, he looked up the subjects he'd need to know and devoured the nearest public library. When the application sheet asked for a school, he'd said he'd been homeschooled, which was more or less accurate. Then it was time for the practical portion. All the heroic student hopefuls were sent to an auditorium where Present Mike explained the exam in all his loud glory. Akatani may or may not have fanboyed a bit. Fine a lot. Present Mike was very cool, and anyone who denied that was a dirty liar. Aside from a boy in glasses asking about the fourth robot on the handout, there were no other interruptions before the examinees were off to take the practical. The testers had asked them to change into their gym clothes, but as Akatani hadn't really attended school, he settled for a dark, almost black tracksuit with 2 light gray stripes up the sides of the arms and legs. As the examinees waited to start, Akatani noticed the brown-haired girl from earlier standing nearby. He considered going over to say hello, maybe thank her, but a hand landed on his shoulder and he suppressed a flinch. "Were you going to talk to that girl?" Glasses boy asked sternly. "Can you not see that she's concentrating right now? Are you just here to be a distraction for people taking the test? If you are, please go home." Akatani could hear the other examinees whispering, but before he could say anything, Present Mick's voice sounded over the intercom. "ND start." Instinctively, Akatani bolted into the testing ground, barely noticing as the pro-hero shouted at the other examinees who hadn't moved an inch. One for all. All Might himself said he wouldn't be able to control his power right away, but that was only in terms of his actual body, right? One for all was an enhancement quirk, so what if he enhanced his quirk itself? Just in time, he turned a corner into a shadowed street beside a tall building with a few robots, all of which turned to him. Well, no better time than the present. Concentrating, he watched as a robot disappeared, only to reappear high in the air, above the other 2, falling and crushing them. He blinked at the destroyed machines, before grinning. He had a strategy now. Running around, he proceeded to repeat the process, careful to keep to empty streets with no examinees to be collateral damage. He also shadow traveled with the robots halfway in, then cut off the connection so they were split in two. He couldn't do more than two at a time though, so to get robots down quicker, he tried using the shadows inside to get their inner wiring out, effectively stopping them in their tracks. Knives to the wiring also worked when he started to feel the fatigue that came with his quirk set in, as did luring the robots to blast other robots. Akatani was absolutely falling into a sleep coma after this. As he reached a more populated street, with other examinees taking down their own robots while counting, he probably should have kept track. Oh God. He hoped he had enough. A rumbling noise grabbed his attention. So that's the 0-pointer. The other examinees started running away. Who wouldn't? That thing was the size of a skyscraper, and Akatani was about to join them when he heard a cry from the direction of the 0-pointer. The nice brunette from before was there, right in the path of the 0-pointer, stuck under some rubble. Unconsciously, Akatani started running towards the robot, hardly even realizing as his feet carried him toward the thing. His brain went 100 miles in a few seconds as he tried to figure out how not to die. It's too bright for my shadows to have much effect, and I really don't think I can move any towards here now, plus it's almost noon. Breaking his limbs it was. Firing up one for all, he jumped, rocketing towards the 0-pointer, and from the bottom of his heart, yelled. Smash! Is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to. Recovery girl healed his broken arm and legs just fine, giving him some gummies to restore his energy. He hadn't heard from All Might since the day of the exam, and so he spent the week leading up to when he'd get his letter alternating between texting Yayarozu, hanging out with Dabi, and going out as Hikage. Hikage was the name he used when he ventured into the shadier parts of town. Having his actual name out there was a bad idea, especially since he planned on going to UA. A hero in training would be better off unconnected to the seedier parts of Mizudafu. His Hikage persona had Akatani use purple contacts and a gray wig, bearing no resemblance to Akatani. As he walked down the street, he kept his head down and hood up, looking by all means like another teen stoned to hell and back, blending in. Attention wasn't something he wanted, especially not when he was looking for information. Dabi had yet to bring up the rumors of someone attacking UA, but that didn't mean Akatani wasn't going to investigate himself. While Dabi was fairly well known and had a decent standing underground, he also had a tendency to stand out and scare people. It came with the whole overcooked beef jerky look. Hikage, however, was nondescript, and people tended to have looser lips when they didn't notice anyone in particular listening. Walking around, making sure to look fairly aimless and stagger every once in a while, he headed to a ratty building, indistinguishable from every other building on the street. What made this particular building special was that it hosted the nightly quirk fights, a great place to place bets, get drunk, study fighting styles, and, most importantly, get information on what was going on with the outcasts of society. He gripped his knives in the pocket of his oversized hoodie, walking past the bar towards his goal for the evening, a woman aptly dubbed Kitsune. She was the first person Dabi had introduced Akatani to, the owner of the ring and overall very badass. Kitsune caught sight of him and a grin stretched across her face, one of genuine delight at the sight of one of her favorite frequenters. In a place like this, a polite boy was a rarity. Hikage. Oh, it's been so long. She grinned with sharp teeth, dark eyes gleaming. A few of the other patrons leaned away from the woman, who disregarded their reactions entirely. Akatani supposed she could be off putting black scara, toxic green irises, sharp shark-like teeth, and pale green skin with a scar across the bridge of her nose. She was kind, though, so he didn't really care. I mean, she'd probably drop him in a millisecond if he became a danger to her or her business, but that was how everyone was. Kitsune's and I saw you last week. He replied softly, but he understood what she meant. He'd made the mistake last week of interrupting a drag deal between some gang connected to a bigger Yakuza group, pissing them off and earning him a few enemies and making Dabi ground him from Hikage for a week. Kid, you know what I mean. Now, you're not the type to visit just to say hello, and I know for a fact that nobody special is fighting tonight. What's up, brat? He didn't understand why everyone he met decided he was a brat. He was the epitome of a good, kind soul. He ignored the part of his brain that snorted at the notion, sounding suspiciously like Dobby. Glancing around at the crowd, he spoke, assured nobody was taking interest in their conversation. I heard a few rumors, something about an attack on UA? Sounds pretty risky, so I was wondering. Kitsune adopted an understanding look, followed by a frown of annoyance, though he could tell it wasn't directed at him. Yeah, I know the group. Impertinent lot, came in and stood on my bar, preaching about defeating All Might and looking to recruit. I know a bunch of fellas who joined. Akatani jolted at her words. Defeat All Might? But Dobby had said the attack was on UA. All Might, as far as the public was concerned, had no connection to the UA. So this group had inside information. Do they this group, that is, do they have a name or something? He asked, hoping to get more on this new villain group. They had to be either very sure of themselves or very stupid, and he was thinking it was a combination of the two. Yeah, they called themselves the League of Villains. She snorted. Super original, I know. Akatani hummed. Thanks, Kitsune. She turned to him, tilting her head. You aren't staying for the fights? I normally see you watching even the newbies, scribbling away God knows what in that notebook of yours. Not tonight. I got something to do tomorrow, and you know how these always take a while. She nodded in understanding and, bidding Kitsune farewell, he headed off, greeting a few others on his way out. Though Hikage was nondescript, it'd be weird if he didn't know anyone. Plus, getting all your information from one source was a good way to lose the critical mind he'd built up, and every story had to be taken with a pinch of salt. Walking down the darkening street, he ran his finger alongside the blade of his knife, careful not to cut himself as he let himself think over the new information. League of Villains? Huh? Dobby wondered at his friend's knack for getting into weird but situations. Yes, he was a 14-year-old living alone, 15 on paper, but whatever. Yes, he had an odd relationship with knives. Yes, he had a tendency of speaking before his brain could realize it'd be better to shut up. But that did not explain why he called him at 5 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday to help him out of a mailbox. Why the f... was he stuck in a random mailbox, anyway? When he voiced said question to said teen, he seemed to momentarily die from embarrassment. Well, I had to give UA an address, but if I gave them my actual address they'd wonder why the hell a 15-year-old is living in an abandoned warehouse in the middle of nowhere, so I kinda wrote down the nearest decent apartment, but then I remembered they'd send letters out today, and that there's be no explanation as to why the Tanakas would have a letter from UA for Akatani Mikumo, so I figured I'd get the letter before they did, but I underestimated how hard it is to get a letter from a locked mailbox, and then a raccoon came by and I fell forward really fast and got stuck. Dobby stared at the boy for a long moment, long enough to make him squirm awkwardly before he let out the longest sigh he'd ever had. This is why you're called Yamikumo, you absolute. Hey, you two aren't authorized to be in here. Both boys turned to see a security guard, and, glancing at each other, made the unanimous decision to run. Dobby internally sighed as they sprinted away from the security guard. He didn't get paid enough for this sheet. Is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to. After the traumatic ordeal of Dobby prying him out of the mailbox with a crowbar and the two running when the building security realized there were two intruders, Akatani finally sat at the work table he'd brought to the warehouse to open the letter. First, though, he texted Yaoyorozu, who'd also gotten her letter. Taking in a deep breath, he ripped it open, and a projector fell out, turning on to a video of All Might. So he was teaching at UA. The League of Villains already knew that. But how? Who could have known and leaked that? I am here as a projection. Akatani grinned at his mentor's announcement. Though All Might was still his favorite hero, he was also a massive dork. Young Akatani, you passed the written exam with top marks. And as for the practical, you scored 72 combat points, enough to earn you third place out of all the examinees. Akatani gaped at the screen. No way. He'd assumed he'd got enough points to pass, having not taken the liberty to count, But third place? But that's not all. What? Please watch this. Akatani's eyes followed along as the brown-haired girl from before came on screen, hoping to share her points. I know he probably has loads of points, but he saved me. I want to thank him somehow, even if it's only a few points. There was a secret scoring system. You, young Akatani, earned 60 rescue points, bringing up your score to 132, making you the highest-ranking examinee. If he'd been gaping before, now he was absolutely gobsmacked. Congratulations, young Akatani. This is your hero academia. For a moment, he just sat there as the projection shut off. Then, holy shit, he whispered to himself. He got in. He got in. And not only did he get in, but he got in with top scores. He was going to be a hero. This was actually happening. He laughed in delight, grinning at the inconspicuous little projector that brought him so much joy. He jumped and fell, flailing out of his chair, as his phone buzzed, and he remembered Yaoyorozu asking to confirm they got in if they got in. Sending off a text, he smiled lightly as she replied that she, too, got in, proposing they meet for a celebratory lunch. Since it was currently about 7 in the morning, they wouldn't meet for a couple hours yet. Looking in the mirror Dabi had insisted he needed, he realized he looked dead. Well, to be fair, he always looked dead, but whatever. It was kinda of a side effect of his quirk. Since he used shadows, the more shadows there were the more rejuvenated he got, so at night it was like a caffeine shot. He already had trouble sleeping, so add in his quirk-induced insomnia and he was practically nocturnal. Frowning, he ruffled his hair a bit before grabbing a hoodie and slipping on his obnoxious, red shoes. Coffee would help. Preferably a lot of coffee. Maybe with extra espresso shots. Nice. He could imagine Dabi's voice, full of mock wonder, commenting that this was why he was so short. You, imaginary Dabi with your stupid long limbs. Humming, he looked up places to get his caffeine. His regular spot was closed till about 9, so he was hoping to find someplace open now. Scrolling through nearby shops, Akatani grinned as a cat cafe popped up, only about 10 minutes away by train. 10 minutes later found him standing in line, practically glowing at all the cats milling around. He placed his order, iced Americano for espresso shots. It looked like the souls of the dead but he didn't care, and sat at a table, in front of a purple-haired kid who seemed to be dozing off. Purple looked up as he sat, springing awake, and Akatani got a good look at the killer bags under his eyes. Akatani had his own, but he covered them up along with his freckles too recognizable, too obvious. Purple, he was picking up Dabi's habit of making up nicknames, oh no, narrowed his eyes at him, and Akatani nodded in greeting. Purple seemed content to glare at him, so Akatani sat back, scrolling on his phone. He did a double take at the new text from All Might, asking him to meet him at Dagoba Beach later. Sending a confirmation, he was momentarily distracted as a cat fluffy, white and gray, big blue eyes climbed onto him, patting around, up his lap, onto his shoulders, tail flicking him in the face. The fluffy creature let out a meow, then settled on his shoulders, tail swinging lazily to brush his face. He blinked and got a face full of fluffy tail. So I see you've met Sparkles. Purple said, voice as dead as he looked. Sparkles? Akatani asked, and Purple shrugged. I question the names of some of these cats too. Akatani cracked a grin. Purple raised an eyebrow in question. It's kinda ironic I've been calling you, Purple, in my head this whole time. Purple snorted. So creative. Akatani huffed a laugh, squawking as Sparkles whacked him in the face with his tail, jumping down from his shoulder before trotting away. My name's actually Shinso, but I guess Purple works too. Akatani. Nice to meet you, Shinsu-san. Large iced Americano, for extra espresso shots for one. Akatani. A barista called out, and he grabbed his drink, thanking the lady before returning to Shinso. The other teen eyed his drink with something akin to approval. Akatani supposed he probably had questionable tastes too. So, Shinso started, why are you up so early? Robbing mailboxes. Akatani replied without thinking. Shinso almost choked on his own drink at the response. Akatani flushed bright red. Do I even want to know? Akatani grimaced. Definitely not. The pause. What are you doing up so early? Bold of you to assume I went to sleep at all. The use of an old meme spurred a laugh out of Akatani, who'd gotten a rough run-through of pop culture from Dobby and self-study, copious hours online, falling into the depths of the interweb. I was looking at responses for high school applications. Oh, did you get into the school you were aiming for? Shinso scowled. No, he glared into the table, fists clenching around his mug. The testing was clearly meant for those with flashy quirks. I applied for another course at the school too and I got in, but it's not what I was aiming for. Not to presume, but do you mean the UA hero course? Shinso looked up in surprise, then glared defensively. Yeah, what of it? You gonna make fun of me too? Akatani blinked in surprise at the sudden aggression. No? I don't see why I would. I just wondered 'cause I took it too, so I figured you might mean that. You want to be a hero, right? He realized he was kind of seeing a replica of his first conversation with Yaoyorozu, except this time Shinso was on the defensive. Shinso dropped his glare, looking down with a nod. Akatani beamed. Awesome. Me too. Shinso scowled at his hands again. Yeah, well, I was rejected. How can I possibly become a hero? Akatani mouthed a soft, oh, as he realized the boy's problem. Well, you said you made it into Gen Ed, right? Shinso nodded. Well, win the sports festival. I heard people who do especially well then can get moved to the hero course. If you win, they'll have to let you in. Shinso looked at him skeptically. Has that ever actually happened though? Yeah, actually. You know Eraserhead? Well, maybe not, he's fairly unknown, but that's in 10, Shinso interrupted him. Eraserhead was in Gen Ed? Akatani nodded enthusiastically. Erasure doesn't work too well on robots, so he got in through the sports festival. I'm sure you can too, if you prepare beforehand. Shinso seemed in awe. Thank you, Akatani-san. Akatani tilted his head. What for? Shinso blinked. You're the first person other than my parents to support me wanting to get into the hero course. Now it was Akatani's turn to blink. In that case, everyone other than your parents is AD-. This shocked a laugh out of Shinso, and Akatani grinned back as he stood, returning his empty glass to the bin of used cups, before waving goodbye to Shinso and heading over to Dagoba to meet his mentor. Is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to. Toshinori stood, watching the sun climb higher in the sky as he waited for his successor to arrive. Abruptly he sneezed. Bless you. Akatani said. Thank you. Toshinori responded absently. Then he jumped, whirling around to face the boy, who tilted his head. All might. Young Akatani. You are quite silent on your feet. I didn't realize you were there. Akatani glanced at his feet. Sorry. Toshinori waved a hand. It's quite all right, young Akatani. The reason I called you here was to first apologize. I haven't had the time to contact you all week. It's all right, All Might. The other reason was to congratulate you on getting in. You did wonderfully, surpassing my own scores even. Akatani grew flustered at the praise. It seemed to be a common thing, as though he was unused to genuine praise. Yeah, thank you. He sputtered, arms flailing. Toshinori gave in to the urge and ruffled his fluffy black hair fondly, causing the boy to flush even more. But young Akatani, I do have to ask, what is your original quirk? I didn't have the chance to ask before, but it seems to be some kind of teleportation, no? Arm flailing done, his successor looked away, seeming to look anywhere but at Toshinori. When he'd found the kid, and decided to make him his successor all those months ago, he'd chosen him for his heroic actions, saving another young boy from a sludge villain though he knew neither the other boy nor seemed to have intended to save the boy. His feet had moved before he could think, and Toshinori recognized the heroic spirit in the bright boy. For whatever reason though, he seemed reluctant to talk about himself. Toshinori hadn't wanted to overstep too much, and so never asked. I can kinda control shadows and teleport people and things through them? But people are harder because it's really disorienting and I have to be careful to not hurt them by closing the tunnel too soon. I can kinda move shadows too, but it's pretty taxing and I don't see why I'd need to. I can't do it to a big extent. Plus, I get headaches when I do. The boy trailed off into silence, though his lips moved as though he were muttering to himself silently. Toshinori also noticed he did that a lot, never muttering out loud, but going through the motions. That's an excellent quirk. Very useful for speed and stealth, no doubt. And the blush was back, as the boy stammered at the praise. Toshinori watched with a fond smile as his boy stumbled over his words. If he promised to genuinely praise the boy more often, well, nobody had to. No. Is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to. For lunch, Akatani and Yaoyorozu met up for soba, sitting at one of the outdoor tables to enjoy the warming weather. As they ate, they talked about anything and everything. As it turned out, Yaoyorozu shared his love for quirks and passion for studying, though she preferred tea over coffee. Say, Yaoyorozu, you know my quirk, but I don't know what yours is? She blinked in surprise. Oh, you're right. Well, my quirk is creation. I can turn my fat lipids into anything, so long as it's non-living. Akatani felt his jaw drop. That's amazing. Can you create water, then? Would it be safe to drink? There's so many applications. How does it work? Do you need a clear mental image of the structure of the item? What about the molecular structure? Could you produce gas like midnight? How complex of a structure can you make? If you create something, is it possible to stop halfway? What would happen then? Would the item sink back into you, or fall down half-finished? Could you make something with a different gravity than anything else? Can you create new elements or fusions of elements? What? He cut himself off as he noticed Yaoyorozu looking increasingly concerned at his he'd said all of that without breathing. Well, I didn't get most of that, but I do need to know the molecular structure and structure of the object itself. Akatani made an "oh" softly. What about? And that's how the two spent the next few hours, Akatani asking questions to his heart's desire and Yaoyorozu happily answering, both absolutely pleased to find someone equally interested in quirks. And if they both went home later, entirely content, finally knowing someone who shared their passion, well, that's nobody else's business. Akatani's first official day at UA commenced with him texting Dabi first thing, with only one word, help. Naturally, receiving one such text sent Dabi into a panic, though he'd deny it vehemently if asked later, and the scarred boy rushed to his friend's aid. Which leads to now. A tie? You called me over with a cryptic but text because you can't tie a tie. Dabi seethed, mostly to hide how genuinely afraid he'd been. The last time Akatani had sent him a text like that, it had been much more severe. The boy had been a wreck, hyperventilating and crying after a close call with them. It had led to him spilling his entire story, which Dabi had reciprocated in kind later. They both trusted each other far more than was probably smart, but it was mutual trust, at least. Akatani pouted. Yes, a tie. I can't go to UA, the most prestigious hero school in the country, with my tie tied wrong. It'd be a crime. He whined yes, whined, and anyone who said otherwise was dead wrong. Dabi rolled his eyes, but beckoned the boy forward regardless. Now watch, okay? I'm only doing this sheet once, so pay attention, brat. Carefully, step by step, he tied the bright red tie, then untied it so Akatani could recreate his movements. It took nearly 15 minutes, but by the end of it he had the process down by heart. Grinning, Akatani looked up at Dabi. Thanks. Dabi huffed and shoved his shoulder. Shut the f*** up, brat. Akatani grinned wider, and opened his mouth to no doubt taunt the other boy, but Dabi stopped him before he could start. Aren't you gonna be late? Dabi smirked as Akatani panicked, rushing around to collect his things, shoving them into the hideous, yellow backpack he'd gotten at a thrift store. Barely remembering to say goodbye, Akatani jumped into a shadow, popping out in the shadow of UA's gates, much like when he dropped off Yaoyorozu the first time. Panting slightly, the process of shadow travel disoriented everyone. Even Akatani. He straightened from where he was partially crouched in the shadows, once more left to stare at the looming building that was UA. Despite having been in the building before and having seen it literally dozens of times, he just now was hit with the realization that this this place was where heroes were made, was full of heroes, was where he was going to be almost daily for the next 3 years. He could hear the master's voices in his head, telling him to run. This place was not safe, he had to go. Abruptly, he smacked both cheeks, snapping himself out of his trance and, almost on autopilot, forcing himself forward. He followed the route he'd memorized by heart to Class 1A. Blueprints of the school being public was a safety hazard, so he'd had to hack the system a bit, a skill he'd learned back with Nope, not today brain, today is a happy day, none of that, Nope. Stopping, he looked up at the huge red door, pondering why it was so big. Probably to make it more accessible to people with all sorts of quirks, pretty clever. Hey, are you planning on going in? Whirling around, he came face to face with the brown-haired girl from the exam. From the widening of her eyes, she recognized him too. It's you. The plain one with the curly hair. You punched the 0-pointer. Akatani was almost offended at that description, plain one. But then he reminded himself that it was intentional. He didn't want to stand out. This was good. Yeah, that's me. I'm glad you're okay though. She tried to share her points with him. He remembered. She said he'd saved her. Like a hero. Oh, thank you. I do think we should go in now though. Right. Opening the door, he came to a halt as the boy he recognized as Glasses Boy from the exam was right in front of him, introducing himself in the most uptight way, then apologizing for judging Akatani and jumping to conclusions on the day of the exam. It was all very fast, and by the time his words processed, a new voice piped up. If you're here to socialize, leave. Turning, he looked for the speaker, met only with air, but then he looked down to see a giant yellow caterpillar. The caterpillar turned, and he realized, no, this was a person in a sleeping bag. Looking at their face. Eraserhead. Akatani blurted and the man blinked. That's Aizawa-sensei to you. He said, then stood, shedding the sleeping bag to reveal a shabbily dressed body and long scarves. The man walked to the front of the room, and the standing students all sat. Akatani was behind a boy with spiky blonde hair and a menacing scowl. It took you 8 seconds to quiet down. Time is a precious resource. You lot aren't very rational, are you? He regarded them. My name's Aizawa Shoda. I'll be your homeroom teacher. Akatani blinked. This morning was moving way too fast. Was this how school always was? Change into your gym clothes and head out to the grounds, Aizawa-sensei said, then walked out of the class. Walking out into the field, Akatani tugged at the long sleeves of his gym uniform. The regular uniform had sleeves to the elbows, but thankfully the school had heeded his request for full sleeves. It certainly wasn't the first time they'd modified the uniform, considering the various mutation quirks. He wondered why they weren't at the entrance ceremony, but that was answered fairly quickly. Quirk assessments. Bakugo, Aizawa-sensei called. Come here. The spiky blonde who Akatani sat behind stepped forward, and he realized it was the boy from the sludge villain attack, the same attack that had garnered All Might's attention. He watched as the class exploded into excited chatter, as Aizawa-sensei grew increasingly irate. Fun, you say? You're here to learn to be heroes. He narrowed his eyes. Fine. Whoever places last will be expelled. The class exploded in protest and murmurs of how unfair it was. Aizawa-sensei grinned. Welcome to the hero course. The assessments were fairly straightforward. 50-meter dash, ball throw, standing long jump, seated toe touch, sit-ups, endurance running, grip strength test, and sustained sideways jump. For the 50-meter dash, Akatani silently thanked whichever deity was watching over him that they were in the shadow of the building, shadow traveling to the end in an instant, the little machine announcing his time of 0.9 seconds. The highest score in that section, beating out even the kid with a literal speed quirk. He tuned out the whispers, wondering what his quirk was, as it had been too fast to see properly. For most of the other tests, he relied on his regular physical abilities, falling around the top of the group, not counting those with quirks especially suited towards specific tests. He had to be somewhat athletic. It was both a result of All Might's training and years of surviving with them. Then it was time for the ball throw. As he watched the others go up, one by one, the brown-haired girl got a score of infinity. Cool. He pondered what to do. Logically, there were two options. Vanish the ball into some shadow as far as he could, or use one for all and fling it and break his bones. It should have been a no-brainer, but it was almost noon, the shadows were scarce, and he could barely move shadows on a good day, much less after pushing his physical limits for the tests. Breaking bones it was. He ignored the voice in his head that said he could just not use his quirk. Plus ultra and all that. Stepping up into the circle, he readied his throwing arm, calling upon one for all and throwing. Only for his grasp on the quirk to completely disappear. Heh! The device beeped to show 68 meters, and he blinked, then put it together, turning to see Aizawa-sensei aiming his quirk at him, hair floating ominously around his head as though he were submerged underwater. After basically telling Akatani he would be useless if he kept going the way he was, thanks sensei, Aizawa-sensei let him try again, and Akatani pondered for a moment. He probably wasn't dead last in rankings, and he could probably get away with not using either of his quirks. But that felt like giving up, proving Aizawa-sensei right about him. And that wouldn't do now, would it? One broken finger later, just before showing their rankings, Aizawa looked to a boy with purple ball grapes for hair and casually said, "Oh yeah, by the way, I lied. Nobody's getting expelled." He grinned. It was a logical ruse. Looking at the rankings, Akatani notes with some pride that he'd ranked 7th overall, just ahead of the boy with a tail. "Akatani," Aizawa called, and held out a slip to send him to the nurse's office. "Have recovery girl fix you up. Tomorrow's trials aren't going to be much easier." Taking the slip, he murmured a soft, "thanks," before heading off, not noticing Aizawa-sensei watching his retreating back in thought. Recovery girl has not been pleased with him, already seeming to dub him someone she'd see all too often. As he left her office at the end of the day, her healing tired people out normally, and as he had a wacky sleep schedule, she's kept him to let him sleep a bit, and by the time he woke up it was already the end of the day. He stopped in his tracks as he heard a voice call his name, turning to see Glasses Boy Ida, not Glasses Boy and the nice brown-haired girl whose name he still didn't know coming towards him. Once they were within speaking range, Ida spoke. "How's your finger?" Akatani glanced around his hand. "Oh, recovery girl fixed it up fine. Are you heading to the station too?" He asked the two, and they both nodded. Sorry, but I don't think I know your name yet." He addressed the brown-haired girl awkwardly, not wanting to keep calling her brown-haired girl in his head. "Uraraka Ochako. And you're Akatani-kun, right?" He nodded, offering a smile as the three walked to the station. Later, as he sat on the train alone, he took time to ponder. Ida, Uraraka, Yayarozu. He'd met so many genuinely nice people these past weeks. He hadn't had the chance to talk to Yayarozu, as she'd been mostly sticking to a boy who he recognized as Todoroki Shudo, the other recommendation student in 1A. He wondered how long it would take for them to drop him. He learned early on that people didn't act kind without an ulterior motive, and that nobody truly good would want anything to do with him. It was really only a matter of time either way before either he or they slipped and the kind smiles were replaced with contempt, and he wasn't looking forward to it. Dabi was the exception, not the rule. He still didn't understand why the other boy hadn't dropped him the moment his story came out, but he was grateful regardless. He was waiting for the other shoe to drop. For the man to realize what a mistake he'd made. What a liar he was. After all, who could possibly want anything to do with someone destined to be a villain? Returning home, Akatani was greeted with Dabi on his beanbag slurping cold soba. "You know, I'm starting to think you're leeching off of me," he commented, and the fire user arched an eyebrow. "Says the one living off stolen money." Akatani flushed at the reply, but scowled at the thought. Yeah, well, they deserve to be robbed. It's not like they don't have millions of billions more. I barely made a dent. Dabi cracked a sarcastic grin. Yeah, almost 4 billion yen. Hardly anything, Dabi said before eating another mouthful of soba. Akatani snorted, rolling his eyes. It's true if they're one of the richest criminal organizations in Japan. They'd probably never have noticed if I hadn't left the same day. He argued, inwardly grateful towards the other for being so open-minded towards his less heroic endeavors. The fact that they could talk and even joke about his questionable past felt like a weight off his shoulders. It didn't make it okay, and it certainly wasn't something anyone at UA would approve of, but it helped. A lot. So, why are you still here? I kinda expected you to F off to wherever it is you go when I'm not around the minute you had the chance. Such profanity from a hero in training? Absolutely scandalous. Akatani scoffed. Says you. I'm pretty sure I picked up half these words from you. It's good. Such a bad influence. Dabi barked out a laugh, a genuine laugh, and Akatani inwardly congratulated himself. While Dabi could be dramatic, it was usually used ironically, with a deadpan expression underneath. Actual emotions besides disgust and disdain sometimes were a rarity with the deep-fried boy, and Akatani felt proud to have been the cause. In all seriousness, I'm here to celebrate. Akatani looked at Dabi in confusion, and the other boy sent him an almost kind look. It's been 4 years since that day. It had been 4 years since he'd left. 4 years since that fateful night, when he'd finally fled the wyverns and disappeared forever. 4 years since Midoriya Izuku had escaped, and Akatani Mikumo had been born. Midoriya Hisashi and Midoriya Inko had never wanted a child. When Inko gave birth to a baby boy with green eyes and green hair, the couple considered putting him up for adoption, or leaving him on a doorstep. They never got around to it, perhaps out of cruel luck or some part of their hearts that still held empathy and love. Midoriya Hisashi and Midoriya Inko. They weren't good people, far from it, in fact, but they also weren't villains. They just had the bad luck of getting mixed up with some. Midoriya Hisashi was a gambler and an alcoholic. He spent his nights hating his son for being a continuous outflow of money, and his days gambling away everything he owned, and falling into debt so deep he turned to his worst and last possible source of help: the wyverns. And it worked. The couple was out of debt, and all they had to do was occasionally tag along as security for drag cartels and arms deals. All was well. However, good things can never last, and soon, the Midoriyas made a mistake that lost the wyverns thousands. Millions were hardly a debt in the group's abundant funds, but it was the act that mattered. If they got away with it once, would it not lower the reputation of the wyverns? Would it not encourage more subpar work? The boss gave them a choice: their lives, or their son. Naturally, they chose their son. And so, Midoriya Izuku became property of the wyverns, and this is where the story really starts. A few months before the deal was made, Midoriya Izuku developed a quirk. It was a rare mutation, nothing like either Hisashi's fire breath or Inko's weak telekinesis, the ability to summon things and vanish things through shadows, including people, including himself. The limits of it were unknown, but the uses would be limitless. After the deal had been made, Izuku was taken from one hell and placed in another. The Midoriyas had been abusive. The wyverns were just cruel. For 2 years he was trained harshly to become a useful asset to the organization. Profit was everything, and his fate had been decided the moment he stepped foot in the base. Early mornings and late nights, punishments when he failed to reach their goals. When Izuku was 6, he met the others. He called them the demons. It was an accurate title. He was to join them, they said, and be a part of the team of mini-assassins. Izuku hated the mini-assassins. They were all JRKs. Akane and Ryu had been alright, but past tense was to be emphasized on here. The supreme a-hole and favorite of their trainers, Kaito, corrupted them eventually. The very next year, things changed. See, while all the demons had been trained, none of them seemed to possess the mind Izuku did. He had a knack for analysis and a tactical brain to boot. He was supposed to lead them. One would think, as future leader, he'd be treated better. One would be wrong. Training got worse. Izuku was trained all morning and all afternoon. At night he was given a reprieve, but then he did it again and again and again. For 3 years, he was trapped in an endless cycle of preparation for the big day, their first mission. After all, what kind of assassins had never killed? Of course, the night before the big kill, heroes raided the base. One could say this was a coincidence or a slide of luck, but it was anything but. Izuku had, biding his time, hatched a plan to escape. Anonymous tips, slowly putting together a getaway bag, hacking the system, stealing the cash. It had taken years of gradually gathering intellect, but he'd done it. Admittedly, 4 billion yen was a bit excessive, but he was spiteful and they were rich. He couldn't quite bring himself to regret it. 3 hours after the hero's raid of the Wyvern's main base, Akatani Mikumo was born. Well, it was more like an old lady had asked for his name and he'd blurted out the first thing that came to mind, inwardly screaming at himself for forgetting to make a name, but whatever. He stuck with it. Akatani Mikumo was another persona, except this one was permanent. He dyed his hair black and wore colored contacts and covered up his freckles. Akatani was a year older than Izuku, to throw off anyone looking. He'd briefly considered a female persona, but ultimately discarded it. All of this was necessary, if only to buy time. The Wyverns were powerful, and he was sure Izuku Midoriya has a bounty on his head if not as a thief, then as property of the Wyverns. Dabi had been a huge help in creating and cementing the existence of Akatani Mikumo. Though they'd only met 6 months after his initial escape, he'd been the one to acquire a fake ID and birth certificate, and had helped him dye his hair and sort out his contacts. More like he'd been blackmailed into helping, but that was neither here nor there. Dabi was the only other person who knew Akatani Mikumo and Izuku Midoriya were one and the same, and Izuku Akatani intended to keep it that way. Intentions. What good are intentions? The second day at UA felt more like the first. The morning had been full of ordinary classes, at least he was pretty sure they were ordinary. Non-hero related classes, except that they were taught by pro heroes. During lunch, Akatani finally got the chance to talk with Yaoyorozu, with Todoroki following her around. He'd noticed the other boy didn't seem to talk to anyone, with the exception of Yaoyorozu, who was often the one to approach him first. Todoroki seemed to zone out as the two excitedly talked about quirks, eating his soba quietly. After lunch was when things got exciting. Their first foundational heroics class. Akatani wondered what they'd do. Maybe some quirk training? Going over procedures, some tactics type thing? Or maybe, All Might burst through the door, coming through the door like a normal person. Akatani snorted quietly. Nothing about that entrance was remotely normal. Class 1A was in awe at the number 1 hero, chattering enthusiastically at the appearance of the hero, commenting on his costume from the Silver Age, gasping about All Might teaching at UA. The man laughed in the face of all the excitement. Hero training. The class that'll put you through all sorts of special training. All Might said. As for today's activity, battle training. Battle training? Akatani didn't like the sound of that. Battle training before his escape had been brutal. And for that you'll need costumes. The class seemed to thrum in anticipation. Akatani wondered what his turned out like, and if they'd given all the extra stuff he'd requested. He doubted Dabi's suggestion of a mini flamethrower would be in there, but hopefully his other, more tame requests had been included. He'd kinda wanted to use his own gear and weapons, which he'd made just in case he didn't get in case he has to resort to Plan G vigilantism, but he didn't know how to explain why he had a homemade tranquilizer gun and taser pen, nor the unholy amount of knives. Arriving at the change rooms, he realized there was a problem. The changing area was open. When they'd had to change into gym clothes, he'd managed to slip away to a bathroom and change quickly, but this time he'd been lost in thought thinking of his costume and had followed the other boys into the locker room. The reason he'd changed alone before he had scars. A lot of scars. More than reasonably explainable for a regular 15-year-old to have. And questions meant people looking, meant attention, meant suspicions, meant people finding out who he was. So he had to avoid the questions entirely, or find a way to explain his scars in a way that did not immediately arouse suspicion and concern. Hey, Akatani, dude, aren't you gonna change? A boy with blonde hair and golden eyes asked. He thought the boy's name might have been Kaminari. What? Oh yeah, I just kind of feel weird changing in front of people. Another boy, this one with red spiky hair and shark teeth, nodded in understanding. I mean, nobody's gonna judge, but if you're really not cool with it, you can always change in the bathrooms over there. Akatani blinked, nodded and scurried to the bathrooms he hadn't noticed earlier. Didn't ask? He wasn't complaining, but really? Shrugging it off, he opened his case to pull out his costume. He debated this a lot. On one hand, he wanted to be an underground hero to suit his original quirk and avoid the unwanted attention of certain people. On the other hand, as All Might's successor, he felt obligated to pay some sort of homage to the man who wore the brightest and boldest colors out there. The end result was an almost black, pure black doesn't blend in at all, high-necked shirt lined with kelver, full sleeves covering every inch of his arms to meet his gloves, which were deep gray and covered his hands entirely. The long sleeves hid sheathed knives, both about 10 inches long individually and sharp enough to cut stone. He also had his requested elbow pads and knee pads as per Dobby's joking addition, claiming he needed all the protection he could get. His pants were kinda like cargo pants, a dark green material also lined with kelver, and made to be fireproof, waterproof, electricity-proof, pretty much any proof he could think of, much like the rest of the costume. He also has a belt, dark red, with pockets of various first aid necessities, smoke pellets, gas pellets, and flashbangs. The tranquilizer gun and tasers he'd requested was there, but the flamethrower was unsurprisingly not. The belt was made to be easily detachable. If he'd learned anything over the years, it was that people would use anything and everything against you to win. There were a couple knives strapped to his leg, and additional knives in his belt and best part in the heels of his combat boots, which were reinforced, had rubber insulation and were also dark red to match his belt. Opening a small case, he pulled out the earpieces he'd asked for. They were supposed to amplify his hearing so he could gather intel easier and could work as communication devices too. His final piece was the mask. Covering the bottom half of his face planting hurt, and so did punches to the jaw. The sleek metal worked to filter gases, silence or amplify his voice and protect his jaw and mouth from punches. It also had the additional benefit of hiding his face, though a closer look might give him away. There wasn't much of All Might's flashiness, but he supposed the red was enough homage. He wasn't a fan of royal blue and bright yellow as much, anyway. Walking out, he joined the rest of the class as they stood in ground beta, all in their various flashy and at some points questionable costumes. He was glad to see Yaoyorozu had listened to his advice and went for a full-body suit made of self-repairing fabric instead of the near swimsuit she'd intended to have before. Ida's suit was something. He hoped the over-the-top costume was at least lightweight. Todoroki looked ridiculous, frankly, half covered in ice. He wondered if he could sit like that. Akatani-kun, you look so cool, Uraraka said, and Akatani beamed. You too. It's very space-themed. Uraraka smiled, then frowned lightly. It's tighter than what I asked for though. All right. Let's get started then, shall we? All Might was really loud. Akatani winced and turned off his earpieces. Much better. Indoor battles. All Might announced. Many of the most heinous villains are found indoors. Today, in a game of heroes versus villains, you will be split in a 2-on-2 and face each other in indoor battles. Akatani missed the good old days when All Might didn't talk so loudly. One barrage of questions later, and teams were being drawn. Akatani himself was partnered with a guy named Shuji, making them Team B. First match. Team B as heroes. Team A as villains. Akatani and Shuji, who turned out to be the guy with the awesome mutation quirk that gave him 6 appendages, were given communion devices and a blueprint of the building, along with a 10-minute time limit to either capture the villains or touch the bomb. The villain team, which consisted of Uraraka and Todoroki, had a few minutes to prepare before the heroes could go in and start the exercise. So, say, Shuji-san, could you hypothetically make ears from every arm and figure out the location of Uraraka-san and Todoroki-san? Because, if so, I have a plan that should probably work. Shuji looked at him, and Akatani flailed a little. It was probably the height difference, as the other boy positively towered over Akatani. That is, unless you'd rather come up with a plan, which is totally cool by the way, but if not I already have at least 5, 7 if you include the ones where I work alone, but I think that's defeat part of the point of the exercise, and it's be horribly rude to use those, but I made them as a contingency plan in the case of you being incapacitated immediately, not to say that you would be but just in case, and Shuji interrupted his rambling. I can locate them with my hearing. I can also pretend I understood half of what you just said, but let's just go with the fact that I am okay following your plan. Akatani blinked. Oh. Akatani breathed. My plan. What is the plan? Oh, right so. Shiro Hanta had come into the observation room, fully expecting to witness a mostly one-sided beatdown from Todoroki. It made perfect sense. The dude was a recommendation student with a pretty powerful ace of a quirk, and as much as he was sure both Shuji and Akatani were strong in their own ways, there was almost no way they could win when Todoroki had literally frozen the entire 5-story building they were in. That was, until Akatani just straight up walked into a wall the moment the start of the match was announced and popped right behind the nuke. It hadn't even been a full 2 minutes. What the F dash? Both Uraraka and Todoroki seemed to be in some stage of shock at how fast the match was over. Shuji wasn't even in the building. Akatani seemed to be awkwardly rubbing the back of his head and looked to be actually apologizing for winning. Shiro couldn't really tell without audio, which only All Might could hear, but again, what the F dash? Yaoyorozu seemed to be suppressing laughter. So did Uraraka on the screens, though she did look slightly put out from losing so quickly. Todoroki had already left the building. Shiro huffed a laugh. This year was looking to be interesting. The two teams returned to the observation room, and poor Akatani was hounded with a horde of questions, most asking what the hell his quirk was. Shiro could relate. It looked like some sort of teleportation quirk, which was pretty dope if he was being honest, but that explained absolutely nothing on how the small boy had launched the baseball almost a full kilometer during the quirk assessment with Aizawa-sensei, nor, if the tales were to be believed, did it explain how he'd apparently yoed a freaking zero-pointer during entrance exams. He hadn't been on those grounds, but he'd heard the rumors well enough. Akatani, however, was beginning to look distinctly overwhelmed, golden eyes wide as they darted about, so Shiro made the generous decision to intervene. He was mildly proud of himself, but also concerned. Akatani seemed to be hyperventilating a bit at this point. Guys, the dude can't exactly answer if you're all crowding him. Chill. The group seemed to realize they were sort of swarming him and backed away, mumbling apologies as All Might went on to ask who the MVP of the match was. As Yaoyorozu launched into a detailed breakdown of the minute-long match, Akatani's golden eyes caught Shiro's own, and he mouthed a soft, thanks, still looking a bit flustered from all the previous attention, to which Shiro replied with a half-smile and a, no problem. As he turned back to the front, he noticed Todoroki seemed to be watching Akatani, face blank but a thoughtful look in his eyes. Akatani was still a bit mortified by the time school let out. Yes, the whole objective was to win within the time limit, but he couldn't help but feel as though he'd cheated, despite Uraraka reassuring him he totally didn't, and that it'd be much more offensive if he'd gone easy on them. Uraraka was too kind for her own good. He could still feel the phantom of Todoroki's eyes on his back. He shuddered slightly as he entered his warehouse. He decidedly did not like being stared at. Dabi was, for once, not there, so Akatani was left to his own devices. He was surprised at the pang of disappointment at that. He hadn't quite gotten used to enjoying someone else's presence in his life. Crinkling his nose in disgust at the feelings, he pushed away that train of thought. Flinging his school bag onto the floor by the foot of his bed, he flopped onto his beanbag, pulling out his shittier-looking laptop. It was a beat-up old thing, with probably 3 different laptops worth of parts making it up. How people threw out entire laptops, on a beach no less, was beyond him, but no matter. It was something of a slide of luck for him, though horrible for the environment. He technically had 2 laptops: his nicer, school-approvable laptop that he used for legal things and essays. He technically never needed it, but constant preparation, and this one, that he used when he really didn't want his search history traced back to him. Dabi had joked that he was probably only using it for illegal anime streaming, but honestly, illegal anime streaming would be much safer than hacking international databases and criminal organizations. Which was exactly what he was doing now. As nice as it was, trying to completely move on from his past, he still had to make sure his past wasn't going to jump scare him again, So every now and then he looked into the dark web, a daunting task for one not looking to sell any major organs on the black market, to check their whereabouts and plans discreetly and act accordingly. This process had saved his butt more than once, and helps him avoid several almost interactions. As he prodded around a bit, he munched on a bowl of salad, basking in the leafy goodness. Delicious. All Might had insisted on a meal plan to go along with the workouts, but he already was a pretty solid eater in terms of well-rounded meals. His fridge might have been the only quality product in the entire warehouse. Leaving the internet for the day, he stood and stretched, reveling in the cracks as his bones popped, knowing Dobby would be absolutely disgusted at the noises. He was surprisingly squeamish about that. Looking at his phone, he checked the time. 4. He hadn't found anything important online, but that was fine. He grinned as he pulled out a gray wig and purple contacts. That only meant he had time to check his other sources. A half hour later, a teen clad in a ratty black hoodie wandered the streets once more, the hood over his face casting a shadow to conceal the slight smile. Hikage was back in action. One of the only good things about the red light district was that nobody cared. No one gave enough of a shit to ask him about his home life, or his parents, or school. In upper-class areas, cashiers were always so friendly, which was probably a good thing, and he appreciated the kindness, but it really wasn't helpful. Here, everybody had a shitty life, so nothing about him was remotely out of place. Just another effed-up kid with a effed-up life. That, of course, was no promise of safety, so he took comfort in the familiar weight of his knives, and stayed within a decent distance to heavier shadows. He didn't plan to use his quirk too recognizable, too much of an identifying factor to be caught using as Hikage, but paranoia had him ready to use it just in case. Then again, was it really paranoia if they were actually out to get him? Slowly he wove his way around the area, stopping every once in a while to talk with his informants. Another good thing, the thing that really drew him here, was that there was so much more to know. Nobody paid attention to a homeless man or a stoner on the side of the road, nobody cared enough to censor their words. They were the perfect sources of information. Plus, a lot of the people were actually pretty nice and appreciated polite conversation once in a while. He was happy to indulge. It was easier to make conversation as Hikage. And if Akatani took the chance to give them a couple meals, some money in return for their overheard conversations, if he paid them a little more than their info was really worth, well, that was nobody's business. He could always write it off as a kid overestimating the worth of the information's value. People tended to underestimate his intelligence anyway. Akatani's ventures into the seedier parts of Mizudafu provided him with little knowledge on the wyverns, but a bit more on the so-called League of Villains, who were quickly proving to have some sort of plan. What a pain! He muttered, pulling out a notebook. Small-time villains, petty thieves and drag traffickers and other criminals on a lesser scale than some others, had been approached and recruited, with no apparent rhyme or reason. There seemed to be a few with similar quirks, but nothing that truly gave away what they planned on doing. Akatani still wondered how they'd known All Might was teaching at UA before it had been announced. A hacker? A spy? Whatever it was, his theorizing had kept him busy all night, as he went over the possibilities for the attack, the source of intel, the leaders, the group's motives beyond killing All Might. By the time the sun rose, he had a notebook filled with various theories and conclusions, though there wasn't much to go off of. He guessed it was going to be one of two things: a full-on frontal attack, or an ambush, though he personally hoped it was the former. That'd be a much stupider approach, objectively, so it'd be easier to fend off. Hardly a blip on the radar. Considering his luck, though, it'd probably be an ambush, which could do much worse to UA's reputation if it succeeded. Yawning, he went and took a quick shower at a nearby gym, then changed into his uniform. The warehouse, luckily, had running water, but neither he nor Dobby had any experience renovating or building full-on showers from scratch. Humming, he decided to take the scenic route today, actually walking to UA like a normal student for once. He even had time to grab a coffee, with 6 extra espresso shots. It was blacker than his bottle-dyed hair. Akatani inhaled it at an unholy speed, sighing in delight as he felt more awake. Caffeine. So good. So precious. He heard a snort and turned to face the person who'd made the noise. He recognized him as the tall purple boy. Shinso, maybe? He was pretty sure that was his name. Like, at least 77% sure. Possibly Shinsu held a rather large cup that presumably held coffee, and seemed amused by Akatani, who realized he'd been whispering endearments to his own coffee, if the odd looks from the cashier were anything to go by. Maybe Shinsu but also maybe not nodded in greeting. Hey! He scratched the back of his neck, evidently about as adept at socializing as Akatani was. So. Both boys stood there in silence. Akatani noted the other's uniform, similar to his own. Wanna go to school together? He asked, internally dying as potentially Shinsu gave him a startled look. Oh god. He probably seemed like a weirdo now. Oh if dash. He probably lost any chance at gaining a friend. Okay. Yep, wait what? His thoughts must have shown on his face, because might be Shinsu looked mildly annoyed. Why do you look so surprised? You asked. Yeah, but that was more of a spur-of-the-moment thing. I didn't expect you to agree. So you don't want to go together? No, I do. I didn't expect you to. Who says I do? You did. Oh yeah. So are we going or? Yeah, come on. Also. Yeah. Your name is Shinso, right? Yes. Oh. Cool. Did you really call your coffee, my precious? Akatani felt his face heat up, and shoved definitely Shinsu in the shoulder. No. Shut up. Shinsu's low snickering didn't stop till they reached the train station. As the two boys neared the school, they slowed to a stop, staring at the growing crowd of reporters. Shinso glanced at Akatani and almost laughed at the deep-seated horror at the thought of going through the crowd to get to the gates, but realized he, too, would have to go through the mass of people, sobering up instantly. Both boys watched as a student, a brave soul who dared plunge through the crowd, was instantly mobbed by reporters pointing microphones at her, shouting questions all at once so not a single one was remotely decipherable. The poor student looked absolutely startled, cowering under the barrage of attention. Shinso winced in sympathy. So. You first. He and Akatani spoke simultaneously, both caught off guard before laughing, slightly hysterical. Count of 3. Akatani suggested, and Shinso nodded. 1, 2, 3. The both dove into the crowd, expertly dodging microphones and bodies, weaving under arms until they were through the gate, where they stood, panting but out of reach of the wolves. They shared a triumphant grin at the victory, reveling in the slight ridiculousness of pretending they'd accomplished some wondrous feat when they'd really just avoided a couple reporters. It was glorious. Akatani and Shinso parted ways once inside, Shinso heading to 1C and Akatani to 1. Briefly, Akatani wished Shinso had been put in 1A, the other boy admitted to wanting to be a hero, and he was a pretty cool guy as well, despite the teasing. Of course, wishing did nothing, but at least Shinso had a chance, should he place within the top 3 at the sports festival. Akatani personally wanted the grape-haired boy, Mineta, to be the one whose place Shinso took. He made the girls uncomfortable, which was very much not cool for a hero, or anyone really. Sighing, Akatani rested his head on his desk, cheeks smushed as he looked out the window. The light was making him sleepy, which was pretty contradictory, once he thought about it. He hadn't slept in a couple days, and despite the coffee, he felt himself dozing off as the room slowly filled, head cushioned on his arms now as sleep overtook him. Aizawa Shoyuda was annoyed. He'd arrived at UA, half dead from reading Toshinori's notes on the foundational heroics class he'd taught the day before and then going on patrol after, barely catching any rest in between, only to be faced with a horde of reporters who'd caught wind of All Might teaching at the school and were now hounding students in hopes of the latest scoop. He understood it was their job, but did they have to be so illogical about it? After telling them off, he'd arrived at 1A, ready to finally fall into a sleep coma and preferably never wake up. Oddly, the class was quiet, not making as much of a racket as they usually would. That, however, was explained by Uraraka gesturing to a sleeping Akatani with an apologetic look on her face. He would probably have told them off and woken the boy anyway if it hadn't been for the terrible bags under his eyes, almost worse than his own. Aizawa sighed. DMN problem children. Gesturing at the girl to sit down, he stood at the front and announced the day's task, mindful not to be too loud. Not that he ever really was, that was more Hisashi's thing, not his. Today you'll be electing your class representative. Whispers of shock at how normal a thing that was raced around the room, mindful of the sleeping boy. He continued, somewhat grateful not to have to deal with any loud shouts like he dreaded. I don't particularly care how you do it. Inform me who it is at the end of homeroom. With that, he finished zipping up his sleeping bag around him and flopped onto the floor, leaving the children to their task. Akatani woke abruptly. The switch between sleep and awake flipped in a second as he processed that no, he was not in his bed. He went utterly still, body exactly as it was when he was asleep, and listened as conversations in hushed voices and whisper shouts occurred around him. Frowning, he recognized a few voices as Uraraka, Ida, and Yaoyorozu, and opened his eyes, sitting up slowly. Nobody seemed to notice he was awake, which made him wonder why he'd been left asleep in the first place. Surely Aizawa-sensei would have woken him up. The man probably wouldn't tolerate sleeping in class. His eyes, miraculously, weren't in pain from sleeping with contacts in. Listening silently, he realized they were trying to figure out how to elect a class representative. He vaguely knew what those were: a position of responsibility and leadership. Dabi would say it was for goody two-shoes, but what did the job entail? He noted the lump on the floor that he knew was Aizawa, and pieced together that he'd probably told them to choose a class rep and went to sleep. It seemed like something he'd do. He blinked as he realized the class and Aizawa and Ida had all refrained from waking him up, and had time to wonder why, when Azui noticed he was awake. Hello, Akatani-kun, Karo. This brought the others' attention to him. Akatani-kun. You're awake. Uraraka was decidedly much too bright for this early in the morning. Cool. Now, do you have any ideas how to elect our class rep? Akatani blinked and tilted his head. What about a vote? He suggested, saying the first thing that came to mind. Excellent idea, Akatani-san. Everyone, write down the name of a classmate. Yaoyorozu said, ripping out a page in her notebook to cut into mini ballots. Jiro, cheek resting on her hand, twirled an earphone jack. Won't everyone just vote for themselves? Yes, and that makes whoever gets more than one vote all the worthier. Ida announced, drawing nods of agreement from around the room. Akatani stared at his own slip of paper. He really didn't want to vote for himself. Attention, not a great plan, but that left the question of who to vote for. Surveying the room, his eyes landed on the perfect person, and he scrawled their name on his paper, turning it in at the box on Aizawa's desk. Yaoyorozu and Ida were elected class representative and vice representative respectively, with 4 and 3 votes each. Akatani was shocked to see he actually had 2 votes himself, and vaguely wondered who in their right mind voted for him. As he glanced around the class, he noticed Uraraka and Shuji studiously avoiding his gaze, Uraraka whistling innocently. Those two. As the bell for homeroom rang and Cementos came in for their math lesson, he could only find it in himself to be glad he hadn't actually been elected. Dabi would have gotten a kick out of it, probably seizing the opportunity to call him a little nerd, emphasis on little. As Cementos went on about quadratic relations, Akatani felt a chill go down his spine, and instinctively looked out the window, seeing nothing but not actually losing the tension in his shoulders until halfway through English with present mic. It was as though someone had walked over his grave. His gut twisted unpleasantly. He felt like something was about to go horribly wrong. Lunch saw Akatani nowhere near the cafeteria, instead choosing to seek out the support department. The system had for 2 lunches, staggered so all the school's population wasn't crammed into the cafeteria at once. First lunch for heroics and general studies classes, and second lunch for business and support. At the moment, the support department should be having something of a free build time, if his information was correct. The perfect time to do what he needed to. Walking down the hallway, he dropped to the floor abruptly as a door flew at him, allowing the huge, steaming thing to fly over his head narrowly. It slammed into the wall to his right, and he turned to his left to see a girl with bright pink hair popping out of the door, goggles resting on a soot-coated forehead. She blinked, and opened her mouth to say something, but Power Loader chose then to appear, likely summoned by the explosion that had gotten rid of the door. "Handsome," Power Loader said, arms crossed. The girl ignored him in favor of the contraption he assumed had blown up the door. It looked like a pair of boots, but had rockets strapped to the soles. They looked to be smoking. Power Loader sighed as the girl Handsome wandered further into the lab, muttering about babies and more firepower. Akatani was afraid. "So, what can I help you with?" Power Loader asked, and Akatani realized he was talking to him. I was wondering if I could use the labs for a bit? I wanted to make a bow staff, 'cause I forgot to request one to go along with the rest of my hero costume, and I figured it'd be easier if I just made one myself, 'cause then I could weight it on the spot instead of needing to bother you about adjustments. Plus I'm sure you've got your hands full with your class, and a simple staff would probably be a waste of time, and Power Loader thankfully cut him off. He noticed that seemed to happen a lot lately. "Okay, come in, but I'll be on hand in case you have any trouble." He beckoned Akatani to come in. "A staff should take maybe 2 days, tops, and you'll share a lab with Handsome." Before he could finish talking, a loud, blaring alarm went off, interrupting his sentence and causing Akatani to wince slightly at the sound assaulting his eardrums. "Security level 3 has been breached. Please evacuate the area in an organized manner. This is not a simulation. This is not a simulation." Akatani somewhat remembered what this meant, an intruder, and inhaled as he connected the dreadful feeling he'd felt earlier to the sudden breach. Power Loader, a pro hero through and through, evacuated the labs, and Akatani was swept into the group. Minutes and several complaints from Handsome later found Akatani outside, surrounded by support corps students, most of whom had some sort of half-finished invention in hand, a few tinkering away, others probably having forgotten to put theirs down in the chaos. Handsome seemed a bit preoccupied, fiddling with her rocket boots too much to notice that her sleeve was slightly on fire. Akatani patted it out. She didn't notice beyond a muttered thanks. Distantly, Akatani has the presence of mind to laugh at how much he was interacting with non-heroic students lately. He half expected to find himself eating dinner with the business course kids. Mostly, though, he was thinking about who could possibly have intruded UA. Was it the League of Villains? The Wyverns? The reporters from this morning? Something else entirely? He desperately hoped the Wyverns had nothing to do with this. Should they start digging at UA, they were unlikely to find him, but Akatani's quirk was awfully similar, literally identical without one for all, to Izuku Midoriya's. If he could fake a quirk he would, but there was no guarantee he wouldn't slip up in a couple months, years even, and something like that would undoubtedly make people go digging into things best left untouched. That left the alternative the League of Villains. It would fit, he supposed, if they were indeed planning to attack UA, but that left the question of the when and how. Where, as well, if one counted some of the off-campus facilities. Why, if destroying All Might wasn't the sole motive here, and who in terms of who the ringleaders of the League actually were. Akatani doubted it was reporters. Sure, they were eager for a scoop, but to breach UA? That was going too far for someone without ulterior motives. He toyed with the idea of it being another thing entirely and put it away. That was too vague a possibility. It could be anything from an old foe of one of the faculty to a new villain organization altogether. If he spent too long on that, he could probably list 100 possibilities and never come close. As the alarm eventually turned off, the students were ushered back to class, and Akatani listened with half an ear as the class collectively gushed over Ida's emergency exit moment. He was a bit disappointed to have missed it, but oh well. He reassured Yaoyorozu that he'd been fine when she inquired where he'd been, explaining that he'd gone down to the support classes and almost gotten hit by a flying door. The last part caused some minor concern on her part, but that was quickly replaced by excitement as he spoke of his bow staff. Apparently, Yaoyorozu also was proficient with a staff, though she could just make them herself. Akatani wondered what would happen if Yaoyorozu teamed up with the support course, and decided he'd leave that for another day. Heading home, he passed by the front gates, and stared at the dust where the UA barrier once stood with a calculating look. It was as though the barrier had just disintegrated. He didn't remember anyone who had such a quirk from his time with the Wyverns, but that meant nothing. It had been 4 years. New members with unknown quirks were entirely within the realm of possibility. Looking at the dust, he turned on his heel and Shadow traveled home, ignoring the clench in his gut and the foreboding feeling that threatened to overcome him. Dabi, unfortunately, was not used to midget brats popping out of the shadows right beside him. Mother Phew, Akatani interrupted him mid-curse. Language. Dabi, a hand to his chest, glared at him. Off, you spooky midget. Akatani sent him a flat look, amusement underneath. I live here. Dabi scoffed, deep-fried hand rubbing his chest absently. He moved out the bag he'd brought, with cold soba for two. Akatani had been skipping meals. He could sense it. Ignoring the boy's mutter of, yes, mother, he carefully watched his face. He hadn't pointed it out to Akatani, but whenever something was bothering the boy he tended to bite his lip a lot, whether it was him suppressing his muttering habit or simply needing something to chew on. Dabi didn't know. What crawled up your butt and died? Not even a thank you? Heathen. Akatani snorted at his words around a mouthful of noodles, nearly spraying his own lap with partially chewed food. Dabi made a loud noise of disgust. Absolute mongrel. Uncultured swine. I am appalled. Truly. Akatani responded by flicking his chopsticks in his direction, splashing a bit of the soup that had clung to the utensils across Dabi's face. He glared and Akatani had the audacity to smile, looking almost as though he weren't a devil sent from hell to torment Dabi. Children. You have them, you raise them on your back, and what do? Dabi huffed dramatically, and Akatani choked on his soba with laughter. Coughing, Akatani manages to wheeze one word, tears in his eyes. Daddy. Now it's Dabi's turn to choke, gagging in utter disgust. You God no. Why would you put that image in my head? That's horrible, you know. Akatani's hysterical laughter had him red in the face, though that could have been from choking moments earlier. You dirty-minded little brat, who put your head in the gutter? You did, you extra crispy chicken nugget. Akatani's wheezed response came. Dabi threw a pillow at him, whacking him square in the face. As Akatani slowly composed himself, he picked up the partially eaten box of soba he'd put down earlier, slurping a mouthful of noodles. For a couple moments, the only sound was Akatani's quiet chewing, Dabi leaning back in his beanbag and closing his eyes. There was a break-in. Akatani's voice was soft, and Dabi felt himself involuntarily still at the words. He sat up a bit more, cracking his eyes open to look at Akatani, who was resolutely staring into his noodles as though they held the secrets of the universe in their flavorful depths. At UA? Akatani nodded. I think it might have been that new group, the one that was going to attack UA. I don't think I told you, but I found out their name, the League of Villains, which is a pretty unoriginal name to be honest, and I think they intended to make it look like it had been the press, but I have no actual proof except for a gut feeling and a stretch of observation, so I can't even really tell anyone. Throughout his explanation, Dabi felt his eyebrows arch higher with every word. What really stuck out to him, though, was League of Villains? Really? That's a horrible name. Where's the creativity? He huffed. Akatani perked up. I know, right? Anyway, the alternative is that it's them, which I really hope isn't the case, but it could also have actually been the press, which I doubt. The UA barrier was practically disintegrated, so... Hold on, the thing was disintegrated? Like, just effing dusted? Yeah. Only a heap of dust left. What an overpowered quirk. Dabi muttered. Anyway, I'll look into it. If it's some new group, they'll either brag or leave tracks, and something like this is bound to have info swirling round. Akatani shot him a grateful look. That'd be great. Dabi sniffed. Of course it would be, I'm great. This time, he got the pillow to his face. The announcement of a field trip caught Akatani completely off guard. USJ? As in, Universal Studios Japan. Kaminari asked. If Aizawa were a less dignified man, he'd probably facepalm, but he settled for a flat look. That might have just been his face, actually. The unforeseen simulation joint. You'll be starting rescue training today with myself, All Might, and one other pro supervising. The USJ is an off-campus facility, so we'll be taking a bus. Grab your hero costumes if you want them, Gym clothes if not or if they're damaged. Get changed, we'll meet at the front of the school. Akatani's costume was practically untouched, so he put it on, then headed out to the bus with the others, Ida attempting to corral them into orderly lines to board according to a seating plan. The look of utter betrayal on his face as the layout of the bus was revealed to be incompatible to his seating plan was pretty comical. Akatani wound up sandwiched between Azui and Tokoyami, towards the middle of the bus. He hadn't spoken much to either classmate, so he turned to his thoughts. Dabi and Hikage had done some digging, asking around a little after the barrier had been destroyed, and came up mostly empty, except for one confirmation it was the work of the League of Villains. That was a relief, even if it wasn't particularly helpful. That, of course, left the question of what they'd broken in for. Information, most likely, but what specifically? All Might's secret of One for All probably wasn't written down anywhere a common thief could just casually access it, and the most they could do would be find his schedule and plan an attack accordingly. However, the only thing was that this little fact would make the ideal time to strike be today. Where he and his class were going to be. All day. With 3 pro-heroes to protect 20 students and fight off the attack. Akatani was understandably stressed. He considered the merits of telling someone, probably Aizawa, of his suspicions. Best case scenario, they think he's a little paranoid. Nothing happens, all is well. Worst case scenario, they somehow connect his suspicions to his past, arrest him or give him back to the Wyverns, don't believe him and get attacked. The League wins and All Might is destroyed, feeling betrayed by his successor in his final moments, and villains overrule Japan, eventually moving on to global domination, and it's all Akatani's fault. Most likely scenario, however, had the teachers listening to him, wondering how he knew that, and investigating his home life, likely discovering his false information on his official forms about his place of residence and sending him well-meaningfully into foster care, where he wouldn't know whether he'd be able to continue to attend UA, and would most likely lose access to his stolen money, informant friends and Dabi. That was decidedly not ideal, so Plan B it was. Plan B was much less stable than Plan A, and mostly was just Akatani being hypervigilant until they returned to the main UA building. He fiddled with his sleeves, fingers brushing the cool metal hilts of his knives. Akatani-kun. Blinking, Akatani realized he'd been zoning out the conversation, and that Azui had just said his name. Yes? Sorry, I kinda zoned out for a sec. What did you need? Inwardly hitting himself for sounding like a dumbass, he turned to look at Azui. Karo, I'm usually very blunt, so I have to ask, what exactly is your quirk, Akatani-kun? At times, it's like some sort of teleportation, but it also reminds me of All Might's. Outwardly, Akatani was careful to keep his face from giving anything away, but inwardly he was screaming. Did they suspect? Had he compromised All Might? Yeah, dude. But All Might's quirk doesn't break his bones, or give him teleportation. Kirishima pointed out. You fools. You absolute fools. Zero said. He doesn't teleport, he just runs really freaking fast. No, he manipulates the space-time continuum and FNGs himself around, and the super strength is just from FING with timing, and the pressure FS up his bones. Kaminari said in a conspiratorial tone. Jiro looked at him like he was an idiot. That makes no sense. No, it makes perfect sense. Time-space fuckery has to have some kind of repercussions if it's used unconventionally like that, so it breaks his bones. You're all idiots. He obviously has a dual quirk like Todoroki, part strength, part time control. Time control? That's way overpowered. Yeah, no sheet, so there's strong backlash. The backlash only really happens when he uses the super strength, though? It's a mutation. How the f does that make any sense? Listen. He had a mutation quirk, so he has really strong legs and runs super fast, and he can channel that to his arms, but he's got noodle arms, so they break. How would that even? Why don't you just ask him? At Uraraka's suggestion, they all quieted down and looked to Akatani. Luckily, the bus stopped just then, saving him from having to answer. Welcome to the USJ. Aizawa said. Akatani was unashamed to admit he absolutely gaped at the huge dome of the facility, only wearing off momentarily before it was renewed, his time by the presence of the space hero, no. 13. He and Uraraka shared a moment of mutual fangirling on Uraraka's part at the presence of the famed rescue hero. Akatani noticed Aizawa sending a look to 13, who discreetly held up 3 fingers. All Might wasn't coming then. Akatani smothered the pang of disappointment at that violently. Now, their voice was tinny, likely because of the suit. Before we begin, I have a point to mention. Or 2. Or 3. Or 4. My quirk is called Black Hole. No matter what material may get Seki into its vortex, I'm afraid it will turn into dust. I use this to remove wreckage and save people from disasters. However, it is also a power that can easily be used to kill people. The hero pauses. And in that way, it is no different from the quirks of everyone else here. Akatani's fist clenched unconsciously. He knew Diemon well all the ways he could use various quirks to kill people with varying degrees of suffering. It had been one of the first things he'd been taught. It was one of the lessons he hoped he'd never have to apply. In this lesson, we'll be studying how to use those quirks for the sake of human life. He blinked, and his fist unclenched as he looked at the hero. Your quirks emphatically do not exist to hurt others. Please leave this exercise having fully understood that your quirks exist to help people. The class burst into enthusiastic applause. Ida moved almost to tears and clapped vigorously. Akatani, too, was clapping, but a sudden shiver went up his spine, and his hands faltered. Golden eyes darted around wildly, widening as they landed on the central plaza where a growing spot of black mist floated a few feet above the ground. Aizawa-sensei. He grasped the man's sleeve, eyes not leaving the spot of the black mist. It was because of this that he witnessed as a hand poked out, followed by a head and a body, the mist expanding and portals multiplying to emit various people, who Akatani recognized vaguely as villains. He whispered as Aizawa shouted for the class to stay back and for 13 to evacuate them as he himself jumped down to the plaza, goggles on. He could distantly hear 13 corralling the students towards the doors, asking Kaminari to try to contact the school, trying to keep the students calm. Akatani felt glued to the ground, his anticipation built up in his throat, choking him, because he could have done more, he could have prevented this. Akatani, come on. Ida called. Let's leave it to Aizawa-sensei and evacuate. He hesitated in turning his back on the fight, not wanting to let Aizawa out of his sight, but also not wanting to be a hindrance in their escaping, ultimately turning around with a silent apology to erase her head. The group was pulled up just short of the doors as the mist villain appeared in what Akatani's recognized as a warp gate, black mist spreading across the exitway. I'm afraid I can't allow that, he said in a polite, almost cultured tone. 13 pushed the class so they were behind them. Akatani noticed both Kirishima and Bakugo tensing and falling into ready positions and, not wanting to risk it, grabbed both of their arms, shaking his head when they looked at him in question, Kirishima, and irritation, Bakugo. Greetings, the villain continued, deceptively demure. We are the League of Villains. I apologize for the intrusion, but we took it upon ourselves to enter UA Academy in order to engage All Might, the beacon of hope. We were wondering if we may be allowed to extinguish it, you see. To Akatani, this isn't anything new, but he feels more than hears the shock and fear rippling through his classmates, and a mixture of dread and relief sweeps through him. It isn't the wyverns, but it's still a threat, still a problem. He considers his options quickly, mind worrying. Option A: shadow travel the F out, preferably to UA. Problems. He isn't sure he can physically do that safely, he doesn't know the extent of the invasion, he isn't sure if it'd be remotely safe, he doesn't know if the Warp Gate villain can counteract his own traveling, and there aren't enough shadows to sufficiently travel with everyone. Eliminated. Option B: only he shadow travels away, gets help, comes back. Problems. He'd be leaving the group mostly defenseless, no sufficient shadows nearby as the USJ is too well lit and the walkway is too open, the Warp Gate villain could potentially counteract. Eliminated. Option C: he attacks with one for all, probably blowing the Warp Gate villain away temporarily, providing a sufficient distraction and redirecting their attention towards himself. Problems, a broken finger. Best choice. Do now. Calling upon one for all, he allowed the power to pool in his left pinky, flicking it at the villain and releasing a shockwave of power that sent the villain careening into the wall behind him, where he seemed to hover, stunned. Akatani was mildly shocked that it had worked, but urged the class to continue moving, not wanting to waste the opportunity. The longer they were there, the longer Eraserhead had to fight alone. Hurrying, the class and 13 rushed to the door, Sato using his quirk to pry the door open. They'd managed to get almost a quarter the class out by the time the Warp Gate villain recovered, advancing on the remaining group rapidly. Akatani, towards the back and closest to the approaching villain, fully turned to face him. That was not very nice. The villain was cut off as a knife flew towards him, forcing him to shift and dodge as it was apparent he needed some amount of time to form a warp gate. Possible weakness. Akatani mentally wrote that down. He turned and glared at Akatani. I've had quite enough of you, boy. He hissed, losing the polite tone at last as he sent a warp gate towards Akatani. Akatani! He heard someone shout, but before he could figure out who, he was consumed by the warp gate. Bakugo Katsuki was sick and tired of this FING shithead villain's bullshit. Akatani, the fucker he recognized only yesterday as the same fucker from the slime villain attack almost a full year ago, had been the only mildly useful person in the shitty class, actually managing to blast the villain away with his mysterious quirk before the villain FNG took him to God knows where. Shitty hair and soy sauce face let out shouts as the mist consumed the boy, and Bakugo cursed as the villain disappeared too. The fucker with the 6 arms dimmin' it all to hell. He didn't know his name extended his appendages, all of them turning into ears. His torso turned a bit, like a satellite, before he spoke. Akatani-san is in the main plaza, with the hand villain and the warp gate guy. Bakugo had to admit, he was somewhat relieved to hear the boy was still in the building. Gravity Girl looked relieved, then paled rapidly. You mean the ones who wanted to kill us? Bakugo cursed again. Stupid motherfucking villains. Akatani let out a yelp as he was thrown out of the warp villain's gate, the feeling nothing like shadow travel but still terribly disorienting. He crashed gracelessly onto the floor and lay there a moment, trying to figure out where he was, before scrambling to his feet. What's this, Kurogyri? A scratchy voice asked, worse than Dabi when he was sick, which was saying something. Making note of the name, his eyes turned to the speaker. He recognized him as the first villain who'd come through the portal, with the weird decapitated hands on his arms, neck and face. His clothes looked pretty ragged, but that could have been to go with the crusty aesthetic thing he had going on. An annoyance, Shigaraki Tamura. This boy distracted me long enough for some of the students to escape. No doubt they'll return with the cavalry. If you weren't our escape gate, I'd kill you right now. Now dozens of pros are gonna be here any minute. It's game over for us. Game over. He paused, turned, and looked at Akatani. Well, maybe. The hand was kinda blocking his eyes, but he turned in the general direction. Okay, you know what? We're saying looked. But maybe, before they arrive, we can kill this brat? After all, he turned to look somewhere behind Akatani, a little over his shoulder. Your teacher is already out for the count. Maybe you'll prove to be more than a useless NPC. Akatani didn't mean to turn, but the mention of Eraserhead had him antsy. He looked to see a huge, hulking black villain with bulging eyes and an exposed brain looming over Aizawa. A blood-soaked, broken Aizawa, arm twisted at an unnatural angle and clear head wounds, yellow goggles broken into pieces. Akatani may have let out a quiet, strangled noise. Eraserhead. He couldn't look away. That was his teacher. His hero. Beaten bloody and possibly dying because he was too stupid to tell someone what he knew. Akatani suppressed the whimper he almost let out at the thought. If Eraserhead died, it'd be Akatani's fault. Yeah. Eraserhead didn't even put up a good match against Nomu. Maybe you'll last longer, this is getting too easy. Shigaraki is cut off as Akatani throws a knife at him, hitting his shoulder. The villain lets out a shout of pain, carefully grabbing his shoulder. Kurogyri moves to intervene, but Shigaraki waves him off. You want to play a game? Fine, let's play. Akatani grins wickedly, a grin he learned from his Dabi, one that screamed, Crazy but dangerous. Shigaraki leaned back slightly, a small movement but a telling one, then snarled. You FNG brat. He hissed. No. Let's play, shall we? Just you and me, Shigaraki. He tilts his head, dark hair falling over one eye and leaving the other to almost glow eerily in the light. Or are you not game? Shigaraki has been all for killing the brat. But oh, if he put it like that. He grinned, a wide thing that showed too many teeth beneath his hand. Let's play. After insisting on checking that everyone was alright really, Akatani was the most injured, Aizawa not included. He'd been brought to Recovery Girl, who'd looked terribly blurry, probably the concussion's fault. She'd healed his concussion, bruised and broken ribs, shattered finger and fractured wrist, leaving only the more superficial bruises and scrapes, as by that point he had no energy left and promptly passed out. Now, he lay awake, the clock in the room revealing that it was almost 3 in the morning. Lightly, he touched the bandage on his cheek, just under his eye where Shigaraki had barely grazed him with his hand. He supposed they now knew who had the quirk that disintegrated the UA barrier. Let's play again. Sometime, Akatani shuddered and wrapped his better arm around himself. He decidedly did not want to play again. Somehow, he doubted what he wanted mattered much. The next day found him sleeping in until almost lunchtime, waking to find All Might at his bedside in a chair, worry on his gaunt face. Akatani smiled slightly and croaked out a ragged-sounding hey. The students had no school that day, to let them recover mentally from the attack. Then he shot upright in his bed, ignoring the screaming protests his bandaged and half-healed ribs gave to that treatment. Turned to his mentor. Aizawa? He asked, bracing for the worst. All Might had a brief look of confusion flit over his face, showing through his concern before being replaced by understanding and reassurance. He's all right. Well, not all right obviously, but he'll recover in time. Here, All Might offered his young successor a genuine smile. You saved him. You did good. Akatani bit his lip. I couldn't stop him from being injured, though. Akatani, my boy, All Might said. As a hero, you can't expect to prevent all damage. There will always be things that we could have done, but living in what we can do is much better. Learn from mistakes. Let yourself grow. He grimaced. That being said, I do owe you an apology. Akatani started at that. Apology? Yes. I am sorry that I came too late. That I wasn't there. I was reckless with my time and you had to pay the price. He bowed. Please forgive me. Don't bow, you don't need to apologize. The fact that you did come, in the end. That's enough. They both smiled at each other, and Akatani felt a rush of affection towards his mentor. Then the door slammed open and Recovery Girl came in, a whirlwind of stern looks and medical coats. Akatani, dear, how are you feeling? Akatani experimentally flexed his hand, feeling the stretch of his fingers. I think I'm fine. Good. She nodded, then slapped him lightly upside the head. You ever break your bones like that again and I'll let you heal the natural way. Yes, ma'am. And you? She wheeled on All Might, who cowered under the full force of her irritation. Why didn't you tell me Akatani was awake, I distinctly remember asking you to do just that. Well, All Might stammered. Oh, I think I hear Tsukachi calling me, gotta go now, bye. He ran, leaving Recovery Girl to glare at the spot he just vacated. She muttered something about top heroes and turned away, heading to a table off to the side to write out his medical report. Akatani blinked at the spot All Might once occupied, then at Recovery Girl's back. A buzzing noise came from his bedside table, which he just noticed. It turned out to be his phone, which he looked at blankly before realizing he'd kept it in his belt, and it had probably been taken out as his costume was taken to be repaired. He remembered taking some damage to his pants leg. A moment of panic occurred at the thought of someone seeing his scars, but nobody had acted any differently, so he'd either lucked out and nobody saw, or they were all refraining from asking for some reason. He let out a breath, and decided he'd deal with that hurdle when he got to it. Picking up his phone, he was greeted with various texts to one as group chat, a few texts from Dobby, and a single email for Hot Topic promotions, a nifty 20% off deal on all Miruko merch for the hero's debut anniversary. Opening the group chat, he was bombarded with texts from various members of the class, quite a few expressing concern over him and Aizawa, which he supposed made sense, but it was weird to have people worry over him. He didn't think he'd ever get used to it, but he was pretty sure normal kids were accustomed to such feelings, so he didn't mention it, instead sending a selfie with a peace sign up by his face and the caption, "I lived," and leaving the chat just as it blew up. Next, he texted Dabi, assuring him that yes, he was indeed alive, and no, he could not keep the warehouse, it was Akatani's warehouse, so F off bacon face. He also requested Dabi come pick him up in disguise later, as he needed a way home that the school would approve of, and he doubted that Shadow traveling home would scream, "Happy inconspicuous home life," like he wished it would. He made sure to request a normal disguise. God knows Dabi would show up dressed like a drag queen if given the chance. Not because he wanted to, no, just for the sheer amusement that came from watching Akatani fumble over his words to explain and line up Dabi's appearance with his made-up backstory. He could be a JRK like that. Just as he finished telling Dabi not to come in on fire, because in what world was that remotely normal? The door to Recovery Girl's office opened once more to reveal a man in a trench coat, a cat-headed police officer, and All Might in his deflated form. Akatani clicked off his phone to look at the three men curiously. He supposed they were there to get his statement on the event, as he had been one of the only conscious people to meet the leaders of the group. The trench coat man, Detective Tsukachi, as he introduced himself, confirmed that thought. "So, can you tell us what happened? Can you tell me what happened?" For a horrible moment, his voice overlapped with the voice in Akatani's memories, telling him to report. His nails bit into his palms as he reminded himself he was fine, he was safe, it was fine now. Taking in a breath, he unclenched his fists where they were hidden in the sterile white bed sheets, and looked up to meet the detective's eyes. "Where do you want me to start?" "The beginning is usually a good place," Tsukachi suggested. The day of the attack or before?" The cat-headed officer's ears kinda perked up and Tsukachi leaned forward in his chair, intent look on his face. "You knew about the attack beforehand?" "Not knew, per se, more like suspicions?" Akatani shrugged. Tsukachi didn't let up. "And you didn't tell anyone?" Somewhat annoyed with the constant doubt and growing suspicion, Akatani responded with a bit of ice in his voice. "Well, it was mostly based on gut feelings and unreliable information, so forgive me for not thinking it'd be taken very seriously." Mentally, he apologized for calling his sources unreliable. They were, but it didn't mean he liked saying it. Satisfied, the detective leaned back and motioned for him to continue. Suddenly nervous once more, he complied. "All right. So, a few days before the day of the press break-in, an old friend of mine who knows I'm going to UA called me, and mentioned some group called the League of Villains making big talk of attacking UA. He didn't lie completely, instead speaking the truth in halves. Something told him outright lying would be a bad idea right then. I didn't tell anyone because this sort of thing happens all the time in their part of town, people saying they can take down you, blah blah blah, the usual. But then the press attack happened. See, a few hours before I had a really bad feeling, and when the alarms went off I figured it couldn't really be the press and narrowed it down to the League. It could have been a coincidence, but I really doubted it, especially after seeing the barrier disintegrated. That didn't really come to anything until the day of the USJ trip. I kinda assumed they'd want to attack off campus, so I was pretty antsy when the trip was announced. We went inside and All Might wasn't there, Aizawa-sensei having said he'd meet us there. Here, All Might had the decency to look a bit abashed. Akatani continued. After 13 gave a little speech, I noticed a patch of mist and pointed it out to Aizawa-sensei. The villains appeared then, at least 30 common thugs and the 3 big bad guys. Aizawa-sensei told us to run and jump down to the central plaza. We tried to run but Kurogyri. Kurogyri? Oh, yeah, that's what the hand villain Shigaraki called the Warp Gate villain. But wait, I'll get to that in a moment. Take your time, tell it in your own words. So we tried to leave, but Kurogyri blocked the way to the exit. He seemed really gentlemanly and classy from how he spoke, but he can get mad. Anyway, he announced that they were the League of Villains and they're to kill All Might, who wasn't there. I think they were going to use us as bait to get All Might to come. A facet of my quirk is super strength, or well, general enhancement really? But it breaks my bones when I use it. So I channeled it into my finger and flicked at Kurogyri. I kind of figured he'd probably be light as he seemed to be composed of mist, and the flick sent him flying back, I think stunning him temporarily. Did you realize that made you a target? Sansa inquired, and Akatani nodded, much to the men's surprise. Yeah, that was sort of the point. If they focused on me, the others could probably escape, get help. Anyway, we got maybe a quarter of the class out the doors, including Ida, who's got a speed quirk and could probably get the UA fastest. At that point, the villain was back, and I think he was supposed to warp us all away somewhere, so I threw one of my knives at him. Tsukachi paused his writing. Wait, continue. He dodged, but he was said, so he warped me to the main plaza where Shigaraki Tamura, that's his full name was, and the Nomu. Shigaraki seemed a little unhinged. He threatened to kill Kurogyri for failing to keep us all in the facility, and used a lot of gaming jargon when he talked. He called my an NPC and kept talking about it being game over. He seemed really childish too. Anyway, he pointed out Aizawa had been beaten already, and the Nomu was sitting on him, and he was on the verge of getting it to kill me too. The cat officer, Sansa asked, but nobody died. Oh, I thought Aizawa was dead, or at least soon to be. And at that point I got pretty desperate to stall, especially since the Noma looked like it could snap me like a twig, so I convinced Shigaraki to fight me alone. Wait, you fought him? Yeah, getting to that. I figured 1-on-1 would be better to stall than 3-on-1, so I threw another knife at him, which is actually how I found out his quirk was 5-point disintegration. Another knife? All Might interrupted. Oh yeah, I threw a knife in his shoulder before we fought. That probably helped me a lot, actually. Shigaraki was fast. We fought for a bit, mostly me dodging his hands, but then I noticed Aizawa moving and got distracted because I thought he was dead, you know? So Shigaraki got mad that I wasn't paying full attention to him and told the Nomu to attack. All Might let out a slight, pained noise. Akatani gave him a concerned glance. I tried to dodge, but the Nomu, I think it had multiple quirks, and it caught me around the middle, which is how my ribs got all messed up, I'm guessing. I couldn't break its grip on me, and my struggling seemed to amuse Shigaraki, so I threw a smaller knife at the Nomu, into one of its eyes. The eye grew back with some regeneration quirk, but Shigaraki seemed mad again and told the Nomu to throw me, which it did. I think that's when I hurt my wrist. The Nomu grabbed me pretty hard by my leg, and I think its grip was so tight it broke it, which was not very pleasant. At least the thing was away from Aizawa-sensei, though. He mumbled the last sentence as an afterthought. I hit my head too when it threw me, but it was cushioned a little by my arms. It gets a little fuzzy after that, but Shigaraki seemed like he was about to disintegrate my face a bit before I managed to kick him and trigger the release of the knives in my boots. Knives in your boots? Yeah, they're really good boots. Anyway, I think I grazed him, but he grazed me too. His fingers brushed the bandage on his cheek absently, and I realized I was in the Nomu's shadow. He paused to look at the detective. Do you know what my quirk is, or? Yes, no need to explain. Okay. So I basically used the Nomu's shadow to shadow travel myself into the shadow of the fountain nearby, which wasn't too big but I fit. Anyway, I accidentally took the Nomu's arm with me, and it got cut off, which was actually a good thing in hindsight. Shigaraki seemed pretty surprised, and at that point All Might arrived, which was pretty good timing cause I was done for by then. All Might beat the Nomu pretty quick, and before Shigaraki could do much more, the other pros arrived and he and Kurogyri had to go, but before they warped out, Shigaraki asked to play again, which was pretty creepy. He shuddered a bit at the thought. By then I think I passed out, but only for a second, and by then the heroes were rounding up the remaining villains and you know the rest. The detective scribbled in his notepad a little more before closing it and nodding to him. Thank you. This will be an immense help in the investigation. Rest up, okay? You did good. Yes, sir. Akatani did not, in fact, rest up. Once Recovery Girl gave him the okay to be walking around, he had Dabi, thankfully not in a drag, pick him up and bring him to the warehouse. Dabi insisted on Akatani getting some rest, but rest had such a loose definition. Dabi had put his foot down on active physical investigations, so he settled for what he did best: research. Pulling up laptop number 1, he ran a program through the quirk registration database for either a 5-point activation disintegration quirk or a warp quirk. On laptop 2, he used the feed from his costumes camera to get a clear picture of both Shigaraki and Kurogiri, which he ran across multiple hacked CCTV cameras, newspapers, and citizenship registry databases, both legal and illegal, with a notification set for every 75%, 85%, 95%, and 100% match. Leaving both programs to run their course, he flopped back in his bed, holding his phone over his head while using his IT to type out his analysis on Kurogiri and Shigaraki's quirks. His finger was still wrapped in a bandage, and his wrist was mostly healed but not nearly enough to write everything he wanted to, so Notes app it was. Dabi had also hidden his new notebooks on top of the fridge, under the threat of setting his bed on fire if he made his injuries worse by writing, and came whining to Dabi to help. Akatani had crooned about Dabi caring, and Dabi had shot him the dirtiest glare from where he was making some okayu, to which Akatani batted his eyelashes madly, wiggling his eyebrows. It was totally worth having his socks stolen. The first day back in class after the USJ attack found Akatani at school stupidly early enough so that even Ida hadn't arrived yet. Leaving his backpack under his desk, he limped to Recovery Girl's office to get his leg brace off. The pro hero sent him off a few minutes later free of his cast, with strict orders not to exert himself too much. Returning to the class, found what looked like a mummified Aizawa by the teacher's desk, both arms in slings and face covered in bandages, the only exception his eyes. "Sensei? Are you supposed to be out of bed?" The mummified man turned to face Akatani, and he had the distinct impression he was raising an eyebrow. "I don't think you have much room to judge." His voice came out muffled from the bandages. Akatani opened and closed his mouth a few times before huffing in defeat. He didn't feel too bad, but he had bandages around his hand, ribs, and leg, gauze on his face, and a few band-aids on some of the little cuts and scrapes he'd amassed. The concussion was the only fully healed thing at this point, as Recovery Girl had deemed it the most important priority to heal. Brain damage was very much not a good thing. He supposed he looked pretty bad, but Aizawa looked like he should have been incapable of moving. Thinking about their condition made his mind turn towards the cause of their injuries. The search through the quirk databases had proved useful in absolutely no way. Nobody registered within the past 70 or so years had a quirk like either Shigaraki or Kurogiri, and before that the systems were a messy place, reflective of the less prominent normality of quirks from back then. Akatani sincerely doubted either of them predated the quirk registry system, so more than likely they were part of the population that simply didn't register. The other program, to find anyone who matched their facial features, also proved to be mostly useless, as his costumes camera hadn't caught anything of Shigaraki without the hand on his face, making it hard for the facial recognition program to run its course. Kurogiri had been caught on camera a few times in wildly different parts of Japan, which was spectacularly useless, as the villain had a warp quirk. The only repeated appearances were near Kamino Ward and in a mountain range on the other side of Japan, but even those were few and far between. These guys were either smart enough to avoid cameras, or incredibly lucky. The internet had also provided no results, both to an internet search of the villains' names and the facial recognition program. Most definitely aliases of some sort, then. The citizenship registry database had no results, but he'd expected that, to be honest. He'd only added that in as a last-minute thing, not expecting much to come of it. He hadn't had the chance to check in as Hikage yet, but he doubted he'd get anything more than he already knew. The research had been somewhat pointless, but he had needed to do something. "Akatani," Aizawa said, and he blinked, looking up. "Yes." Aizawa regarded him and sighed. "You know about the sports festival, right?" Akatani was momentarily jarred by the sudden shift in topic and took a second to respond. "Yeah. The UA Sports Festival was one of the widest broadcasted events in all of Japan, used to draw in internship offers for heroic students and just generally show the potential of the next generation of students. Akatani had watched recordings of the past few years' festivals. Well, the staff at UA have been thinking about canceling it. But why? Akatani stared at Aizawa. A class got attacked, a student badly injured. He ignored Akatani's muttered, "I'm fine. The sports festival might be too much pressure." With all due respect, Sensei, that's ridiculous. If we don't hold the festival, we'll be seen as weak, and it'll hurt the public morale. Exactly what I said. We do need to make sure you're on board with the festival, though. Me? Why? As the most heavily impacted student, your decision is important. That made sense. Oh. Well, I say we should hold it. Show the villains that we aren't going to be taken down so easily. That UA is strong. Good to know. Also, you might want to start preparing your speech. Akatani had turned to return to his seat, but at the last sentence he turned so fast he almost gave himself whiplash. Wait, what? What speech? Sensei? Akatani had the distinct feeling Aizawa was laughing at him on the inside. The wall of students blocking their way to lunch was a surprise. Shinso being part of the crowd was not. His declaration of war on Class 1A had been followed by various cries of agreement, and Akatani violently suppressed the urge to hit Bakugo for antagonizing the other classes. He did not want to be blown up, not even a little bit. All Might's words to him at lunch had Akatani conflicted, to say the least. I want you to tell the world, you are here. As he sat in the little cat cafe he'd met Shinso at so long ago, he contemplated what to do. The logical thing would be to lose within the first 2 rounds, stay in the middle of the pack and avoid standing out, keep his head down. If he wanted to stay safe, he needed to stay anonymous for as long as possible, keep Akatani Mikumo from falling under too much scrutiny. As a hero, he could go underground, avoid the media and press as much as possible and let any memory of Izuku Midoriya die. However, he didn't want to do that. It seemed stupid and it seemed insignificant compared to the very real possibility of outing himself, but he really wanted to be able to go out and give it his all. It was what his mentor wanted him to do. It was what he wanted to do. If he couldn't live freely, why bother escaping? Why bother going to UA if he was only going to do it half-heartedly? But on the other hand, again, was it really worth risking his safety just for a school festival? Then again, wasn't it horribly disrespectful of him not to give it his all when so many others would be? Wouldn't that be rude and cruel to not only the others in 1A, but to all the classes who'd challenged them, to Shinso and that metal quirk kid from 1B, and all the teachers aiding them towards success? He wanted to try his best along with everyone else. To not let All Might down. But was it worth the risk? If you stare at that coffee any harder you might actually succeed in setting it on fire. A voice drawled from across him. Akatani looked up to see Shinso's fluffy, gravity-defying purple hair as he slid into the booth across from him. So? What's got you all broody? Akatani bit his lip, eyes falling back to his coffee, the substance darker than his dyed hair. He couldn't exactly tell Shinso not when Shinso had so much leaning on the sports festival, not when he didn't have an explanation that he could actually say to the boy. He had to make something else up, something that'd have him reasonably stressed. That I have to write a speech. Shinso coughed as his own drink went down the wrong pipe, and Akatani panicked, pounding his back and flailing a bit. After that traumatic ordeal, with many stares and several cats scared away, Shinso finally spoke. A speech? Whose idea was that? He didn't mean it in a rude way, it was just that, in the limited interactions with Akatani he'd had, most all of them had done absolutely nothing to flatter the boy's people skills. The mere concept of giving a speech was probably horrifying for Akatani. Akatani groaned at the reminder. It's tradition. First placed in the entrance exams has to give the opening speech for first years. Shinso raised an eyebrow. You placed first? Quite the big shot. Rather than brag, Akatani seemed to wilt. I didn't realize I had. He mumbled, and Shinso had to tilt his head at that. Did he not want to place first? He didn't realize he'd said the last word out loud until Akatani seemed to flush, face reddening slowly. I wasn't counting my points. And I didn't realize rescue points were apparently a thing that existed. Not his question, but it sure made for a whole lot more. Rescue points. A secret point system the practical exam has, for heroic actions. Shinso hummed, but internally face-bombed. Of course UA had a system like that. They were a heroic school, there was more to heroics than combat. How'd you get rescue points? He prodded slightly, curious and feeling particularly self-destructive. He wanted to know how close he'd been. Kinda saw a girl about to get crushed by the zero-pointer? And kicked it away? Akatani sounded extremely hesitant, but Shinso wasn't focused on that. No, he was too busy having an existential crisis over how in God's name this absolute wisp of a boy, this effing pint-sized child, had apparently been the one to punt a zero-pointer. He'd heard the tales, whispers of a boy who'd blasted one sky high, and he'd seen the monstrosities of robots, but Akatani? Little, doe-eyed Akatani who looked like a strong breeze could knock him over, who lived off of as much coffee as Shinso himself and had the social skills of a walnut, had punted the FING zero-pointer? What the F? He whispered, and Akatani's face turned red as he buried his face in his hands. Can we, not talk about that? Because it was horrifying enough back then with all the attention, and I really don't want to talk about it. Akatani sent him a pleading look. Yeah, okay, cool, yeah, I'll just forget that you casually Yoda FING zero-pointer, yeah, okay, yeah. Akatani ummed and buried his face in his hands once more, ears burning red. Eventually, Shinso recovered from the absolute punch in the face that information had been, and they returned to talking about what had originally drawn Shinso to speak to Akatani, his brooding over the undeniable horror of public speaking. Just, I dunno, pledge to do your best? Plus ultra and all that. Yeah, but that's like 2 sentences. I need a build-up, an introductory statement and a body paragraph and a conclusive statement that'll leave the masses rallied and excited. How am I gonna do that? I dunno, speak from the heart? Let the words flow from your soul? Say something poetic about victory and effort. That's too reliant on me actually being a coherent speaker in front of the entirety of UA's first years. And their families. And our teachers. And the thousands of people watching because it's live television. Okay, dude, calm down. Just, write something generic and inspiring, add personal details, say plus ultra at the end, and you'll be good. Action. He let his head fall to the table with a dull thud. Shinso awkwardly patted his fluffy head consolingly. Okay, so generic being yourself doesn't work. That's cool. How about you emulate? Akatani looked up. Emulate? He echoed. Shinso, seeing some progress, nodded empathetically. Yeah. Just imagine what someone else, maybe an idol or a good role model type friend would say, and say that. That might actually work. Akatani murmured, lost in thought, and Shinso had to grin. Shinso, 1. Akatani's anxiety. Do what someone else would do. As Akatani lay in bed, he looked into the rafters above and pondered, wide awake. By that logic, there were 2 ways this could go. The Eraserhead route, where he stayed under the radar, or the All Might route, he sounded like he was talking about a freaking Otome game, oh god, where he did exactly as All Might said showed the world that he was here. Instead, he'd compromise. He'd try his best, while also trying to hide his original quirk as much as possible. Already, his class has virtually no idea how it worked, so it wouldn't be a stretch to say he couldn't use it much in whatever the events were. His shadow quirk was easily the most identifiable part of him at the moment, so if he hit it, he'd be fine. Since Izuku Midoriya would still technically be in his 3rd year of middle school, hopefully no one would be looking for him in a high school festival. Akatani made a noise of approval at his plan and rolled over, intending to go to sleep. Then he remembered his quirk's stupid side effect and groaned, slamming a pillow over his head. Sometimes, his quirk really essigidi. Akatani didn't have the opportunity to visit the support classrooms again until a few days after his talk with All Might, his friends. Oh god, he had friends having wanted to spend time with him. For some reason. When he finally reached the class, he wasn't hit by a flying projectile until after he came in through the door. He didn't believe it was much of an improvement. Rubbing the spot where Hatsume's stray mini-rocket had nailed him, he glared slightly at the girl before turning to Power Loader, who seemed confused about his presence before recalling his previous visit and directing him to a small workspace next to Hatsume, who was holding a sparking thing. Akatani leaned away slightly as it let out a loud bang and started emitting a suspiciously glowing goo. Hatsume poked the goo with a wrench, humming as it came back looking like it had been eaten away by particularly potent acid. Akatani leaned away more. He didn't want to know. Work on his bow staff was a little slow, but he had to admire the quality of the materials UA had to offer. He'd grown used to the damaged and half-functional materials of Dagoba Beach over the past 4 years, and the change to actually nice materials was a welcome one. He'd taken the initiative to add a taser to the end. On day 3 of his staff's construction, as he kept thinking of new additions and needing to reweigh it, he finally spoke to Hatsume. Or rather, she spoke to him. Model 2 of the bow staff had been a failure, so he sat, redesigning it when Hatsume was in his face, a gadget in hand. "Would you test my baby for me?" Akatani stared at her in alarm. "Baby?" She sighed impatiently. "Yes, my beautiful kinetic energy-absorbing gloves need a tester and nobody else wants to do it. Will you be my tester?" Feeling courageous and a little self-destructive, he agreed. He had not expected Hatsume's definition of a test. "Wait, you're going to what?" "Shoot my mini-rockets at you. You catch them. To test my babies." "Honestly, Goldie, we've been over this." She'd taken to calling him Goldie. Something about his eyes. He found it hypocritical as she also had gold eyes, but he didn't mention it. As he braced himself with his hands ready to catch mini-rockets, clad in thick purple gloves, Akatani could somewhat understand the other student's reluctance. He still did it though. Power Loader almost had a slide when he realized what they were doing and ushered Akatani away, something about not wanting Aizawa on his but for killing one of his students. Hatsume had gained a manic glint in her eye when he'd shown up later to continue the tests. He figured he might as well. It wasn't like it'd hurt to have a genius on his side. Plus, Hatsume wasn't actually too bad. Except for setting him in fire. Twice. The morning of the sports festival dawned with all of Class 1A in a room, waiting to be called to come out. Akatani sat, running through his half-made speech in an attempt at calming himself down. He was aiming for a strong, inspirational but somewhat forgettable, and chose to say some things imagined All Might would say. He also was going to throw in a plus ultra at the end of all else failed. Hopefully that would be enough. "Akatani." Looking up, Akatani blinked as he realized the room had quieted, all eyes on Todoroki, who was approaching him. Once the heterochromatic-eyed boy was within a few feet of him, he spoke. "Objectively speaking, I think I'm stronger than you by a margin, if only because my quirk doesn't rebound as much as yours. But even so, you've not only placed first in the entrance exam and faced off the leader of the villains at the USJ, but you've also got All Might's attention." Akatani kept his face carefully blank of any reactions other than mild curiosity, but internally he was losing his sheet at the last words Todoroki had spoken. He racked his brain for some way to deny or deflect his entirely true accusation and came up blank, but Todoroki continued on regardless. "I won't pry into that, but know this. I'm going to beat you." Akatani blinked again, one part relieved, but mostly in a state of, what the F just happened? Todoroki stared at him, eyes boring into his soul. He realized he probably should have replied by now. He opened his mouth to do just that, but, "Oi bastard, don't go writing the rest of us off. I'm gonna win, got it shitheads?" Bakugo interjected in a growl. Akatani was bewildered at his inclusion in the last statement. He hadn't said anything, why was he being dragged into it? Before he could say anything, he was interrupted again, he might add this time by Todoroki. "I have no interest in challenging you, but I will take you here." He shot a glance at Akatani, who at this point was still cycling through the 5 stages of grief. "Both of you down if you get in my way. Don't go lumping me in with that a half and half." Bakugo growled. "And you?" Akatani started as he realized he was being spoken to. I'm gonna beat you, got it? Akatani was about to reply, when Bakugo continued, interrupted him again, and honestly, why did he even bother at this point? He's mine, and wasn't that something to unpack? And I'll kick his butt and yours, you fiend Canadian flag-looking beach. Todoroki opened his mouth to respond, but Akatani figured now was as good a time as any to cut the growing argument and the tension seeping into the room at the bud. As flattered as I am to know how eager you both are to kick my butt, I would like to argue that he looks more like a Polish flag, if anything. He kept his face calm and casual, but internally kicked himself for saying that, of all things. So much for his brain-to-mouth filter. It had been doing so well lately too. Looking at their faces, Akatani supposed they'd forgotten he could, in fact, talk. Shocker. However, the tense atmosphere was gone now, some of the class snickering at his choice of remark. He considered it a success. While I'm honored to know you see me with such high regard, I'd also like to point out I'm not the only competition. Everyone here will be trying their best. Akatani mentally congratulated himself for getting that out with a straight face. He literally wasn't planning to use half his power. He could hardly call that trying his best. Yeah. You bet we will. Uraraka agreed with an aura of determination, Kirishima, Ashido and a few others cheering along. Figuring he was already in this deep, so he might as well cement it, Akatani continued with a sharp grin. But he lets his eyes glint in the light, in a way he knows is unnerving and looks at both Todoroki and Bakugo. I don't intend to lose. With that dramatic statement, he turned, leaving the class frozen behind him for a beat before they scramble after him, Akatani leading the class towards the arena. As they approached the entrance, Akatani breathed in, momentarily closing his eyes before they snapped open, determined and ready to face the world. The Heroics Class 1A. At the call, they walked forward together, and Akatani bit the inside of his cheek to suppress a visible reaction at the sudden influx of noise from the audience. The crowd's shouts and cheers seemed to come from every angle, and the lights of the stadium were bright, so very bright Akatani doubted he could shadow travel if he tried. In that moment, with the cheering crowd and blinding lights and his class at his back, Akatani felt both elated and nauseous. He wanted to grin. He wanted to throw up. He could see the cameras going around, capturing their faces and the crowds, and he'd bet there were probably camera-equipped drones above the stadium. As the other classes were called out to a much less hyped reaction than what 1A had received which, okay, ouch, that had to sting. He glanced around, spotting the announcer's booth across the stadium. Present Mike had been the one calling out each class, voice amplified throughout the arena. When the last class filed in, Midnight drew the crowd's attention to herself. All right, fair play, everyone. Midnight called as she cracked her whip, and Akatani had a bit of a fanboy moment because she was so cool, holy shit. Now, player representative, Akatani Mikumo of Class 1A. The other classes grumbled a bit about yet another call for attention to Class 1A, but his classmates grinned at him, giving enthusiastic back slaps and fist bumps as he walked towards the podium where Midnight stood. Akatani, for one, felt his stomach twist as he climbed up onto the podium, accepting the microphone handed to him and looking out into the crowd. Uraraka Ochako was concerned. Akatani looked paler than usual going on stage, and even now she could see how her friend's hands gripped the sleeves of his gym uniform shirt. She was a bit worried for the boy. He was awkward most of the time, and tended to ramble when he was nervous. When he'd told her, Ida and Yaoyorozu about his speech, he'd looked more like he was talking about his own funeral. She understood that. Akatani, for all he was kind and brave, was also incredibly quiet and wilted under attention. She felt a pang of guilt go through her. Akatani, who'd saved her twice now from mortal peril, who she hadn't been able to help during the USJ. She looked at the scar he'd gotten, a small one just under his eye, and wished she could have done more, instead of just leaving him to fight the leader of the villains alone, to get injured when she could have helped somehow. She hated feeling so helpless, so useless. Uraraka watched as he accepted the offered microphone, taking in a breath before speaking. Everyone here has been a hero. The supporters and the friends, the pros and the sidekicks. Everyone here has made a mark, helped someone who needed it, even if they didn't realize. Even if it's just a smile, just a word, just the smallest thing to us. They've all been someone's hero, inspired someone to do their best. He took a deep breath. So today I pledge to do my best. For everyone here, for everyone not, for everyone who has needed a hero, been a hero, is a hero, I pledge to do my best. And I hope you all do too. Because we're next. Akatani left the stage to thunderous applause. He honestly had no idea what he'd said. He'd completely forgotten his planned speech the moment he'd looked into the crowd and said something, though it seemed to have done the trick pretty well, so he wasn't complaining. Unless the applause was just polite applause. He did think he'd mentioned doing his best, though. Oh God, he was such a liar. And for the first round, an obstacle course. Midnight announced jovially, cracking her whip. Akatani takes one look at the obstacle course and suppresses the urge to laugh hysterically. The entrance was a tunnel. A very shadowy tunnel. And he was willing to bet the exit was an identical tunnel. The temptation to just shadow travel to the end was so incredibly strong. It'd take 3 seconds at most. As the buzzer went off and the mass of students surged forward, he decided. Caution. He's showing the world he's here. He's making good on his promise. He's winning. Letting the shadows envelop him with a cold touch, he jumps. And lands, inches away from the end of the obstacle course. He walks into the light before he can regret his impulsiveness, and lets himself feel the vibrations of the stadium floor as the audience roars. Incredible! In the blink of an eye, Akatani Mikumo wins the first round, and boy did he make it look easy. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get a round of applause for our winner. Present Mike yells, and Akatani lets himself grin, a camera flashing. He's winning. He knows he'll probably panic about this later, but for now. He scans the audience and, pinpointing all might, meets his eyes, grinning wider. And in that moment he can't bring himself to regret it. Toshinori looks on in pride at his young successor, sending a thumbs up to the boy. He wonders if Gran Torino is watching. He wonders if Nana would approve. But as the boy's bright grin widens, he knows she would. And he knows it didn't matter if she didn't. Akatani, his successor, his boy, he'd never regret picking him. And he ignores the smaller voice in his head, calling him his son. When Yaoyorozu came through the gate with Mineta stuck to her back practically salivating, Akatani took the liberty to punch him. Was it a particularly heroic thing to do? Probably not. Did it feel good though? Absolutely. Mineta's cry of shock, betrayal and pain was probably a bit too satisfying. Dabi might be rubbing off on him too much. Akatani didn't care. Perverts who made people uncomfortable like that deserved to suffer. Kirishima intervened before he could do much more, though it was clear he was reluctant in stopping him. Akatani was somewhat grateful for the intervention as he was most certainly going to get in trouble, and only punching him might get him some leeway. Sure enough, he sat before Present Mike, Midnight and a bandaged Eraserhead a little while later, while the students had a chance to either relax or prepare for the second round. That break hadn't been planned initially, but apparently having a student attack another student was worthy of an improvised pause. Go figure. Looking at the child in front of him, Aizawa Shoyuta could feel a headache coming on. Why did you punch Mineta? Aizawa asked the problem child, who didn't even have the decency to look remorseful. He deserved to be punched. Akatani replied with a shrug. Aizawa repressed the urge to pinch the bridge of his nose. Why do you think he deserved to be punched? He tried again, ignoring the amusement he could feel from both Yamada and Kayama. The kid frowned slightly. He's been continuously acting in ways that make the girls in the class uncomfortable, and now he took advantage of Yaoyorozu-san in the obstacle course by attaching himself to her because he finds her attractive, almost compromising her position in the second round and making her highly uncomfortable beyond that. He looked up to meet Aizawa's eyes. I don't like people who secularly harass others, and he was doing just that, so I punched him. Nice. Kayama commented before Aizawa could speak, and she merely shrugged when Aizawa shot her a glare. What? Kid's right. That may be so, but we're not supposed to condone or support violent behavior towards fellow students. We're teachers. He sighed. That's fine. I knew I'd probably be punished. It's why I let Kirishima-kun pull me away so easily. Akatani piped up. Aizawa sighed again. Yamada snickered. In the end, Akatani was let off with a warning and a few detentions to be served with Aizawa, which was much better off than he thought he'd be. Midnight had given him a high five afterwards, too, which had been absolutely epic. The announcement of the second event made Akatani immediately regret winning the first round. He could feel the gazes of the others, honing in on the 1 million points on his head. He steadily ignored their eyes boring holes into him from every direction, staring straight ahead as he tried to think of a game plan. Obviously, he probably wouldn't have people dying to team up with him, so he had to either put his persuasive skills to use or find someone desperate enough to team up with him. As the time to choose team started, he was taken aback as a familiar pink head practically tackled him, followed by a good portion of 1A, though they all thankfully refrained from jumping onto him. Akatani! Hey, Akatani! Goldie! 1 million. Let's team up. Hatsum said. Akatani-kun. Uraraka popped up beside him. Can I join your team? Akatani was somewhat bewildered. He hadn't expected anyone to ask to team up. This miscalculation was throwing him off. We want to make it up to you. We couldn't help you during the USJ attack. This time, we won't let you down. Kirishima explained, and the others nodded. Akatani blinked. He hadn't considered that they'd feel guilty for not being able to do more. It made sense, kinda. He'd ushered them out only to get injured in the process. It was probably a blow to their pride, not to mention the survivor's guilt for not getting hurt at all while Akatani and Aizawa had been wounded pretty badly. He bit his lip and chose to team up with Uraraka and Hatsum, apologizing to the others as he already had someone in mind. They all reassured him it was okay, and headed off to form their own teams or join others. Alright, but we need our last teammate. Akatani looked around and perked up at the sight of a familiar purple head. Shinso-kun. Shinso turned in confusion. Join our team. He blinked at the 3-1 decked out in inventions, the other two with bright grins, all three looking at him eagerly and nodded hesitantly. If possible, Akatani's grin brightened. Great. Now, here's the plan. Hatsum-sen. May. Hatsum-chan. May. Hatsum. May. May.chan. She sighed. Yeah, okay, it's probably not going to get any better than that. Akatani had to agree. Anyway, May-chan will provide mobility and range with her babies. Uraraka-san can negate all of our gravity except her own to make us more easily mobile. Shinso-kun, if any groups get within range, you can use your brainwashing to make them surrender their headbands and turn them away. I'm not entirely sure if it's possible, but I think you might be able to order them to forget your quirk after. I'll be able to steal headbands if May-chan can send some sort of drone above, casting shadows. The drone can also be backup in case things get hairy. Or if we fly above them and I use our shadows. Our main goal will be to evade everyone and keep our points. Anyway, does that sound okay? Uraraka and Hatsum nodded, Hatsum having started grinning when Akatani had called her inventions babies, and Uraraka adopting an interested and contemplative look at the mention of using shadows. The class was still debating his quirk, and that had been a pretty big clue, while Shinso seemed to be having a minor mental breakdown. Shinso-kun? Are you okay? Akatani asked in concern. Shinso looked over at him, expression utterly disbelieving. You know what my quirk is? And you're not, like, running in fear. Why would I? It's just a power. And a really cool one at that. Uraraka nodded in agreement beside him. You don't think it's villainous? He asked incredulously. No? It's actually a really good quirk for heroics. You could solve so many conflicts with literally no force. A robbery? Ask them to stand down. A suicidal person? You could prevent that. It's an amazing quirk. Though, I'm not sure of the exact limitations and parameters of how it works. Thank you. Akatani tilted his head. For what? That you know what? Never mind. Shinso paused. How do you know what my quirk is? I never mentioned it. Oh yeah, I kind of figured it out. I mean, based on how reluctant you seem to talk about it, plus a few throwaway comments, I kinda deducted. That's kinda scary, Akatani-kun. Uraraka commented. Akatani flushed. Sorry? No, it's scary but like, in a cool way. She reassured him. Impressive. Uraraka nodded at Shinso's suggestion. Yeah. Impressive. Anyway, who's gonna be the rider? Shinso mercifully changes the topic at Akatani's discomfort. Well, I was thinking Uraraka-san and Mei-chan could be the horses on either side for better mobility with Mei-chan's rocket boots and Uraraka-san's quirk. So it's me or Shinso as the rider. Shinso hummed. You be the rider. It'll be easier for you to do your shadow thing. Plus, if all else fails we can just let you go and have you float around. Let's do this. The cavalry. Battle started with most of the teams making a beeline towards Akatani's team. Moments before the teams would all collide, Akatani gave the signal. Initiate Phase 1 now. Really, they only chose that to sound cool. Immediately, several things happened at once. Hatsum and Uraraka activated the rocket boots, sending the four flying above the other teams. Shinso launched Hatsum's slightly repurposed attack drone simultaneously, where it hovered above the playing field, flying around and awaiting orders. The groups that had attacked their teams struggled to avoid collisions. Once they landed, Shinso used his quirk on the various teams that approached them, ordering them to go away and forget his quirk. It worked surprisingly well. Soon enough, the other teams seemed to realize Akatani's group was just going to keep flying away, and instead chose to focus on each other. That almost lasted. Discreetly using the drone's shadow as it lazily flew overhead, Akatani had used the shadow of the inside of his sleeve to summon other teams' headbands slowly, hastily tying them around his neck as they arrived. The effort left his arms chilly, but it was easier than a direct battle. For a while nobody seemed to notice, but eventually people began realizing their team's bands were missing, and connecting their missing headbands to the growing collection on Akatani's neck. The constant careful interactions with the shadows had left Akatani stupidly tired and a little lightheaded, but he pushed it aside in favor of dodging a certain explosive blind as he launched himself at them, only to be reeled back at the last moment by Ciro's tape. Alrighty then, Akatani muttered, before speaking a bit louder to be heard by the rest of his team. Phase 2 guys. Hatsum, pressing a button, activated the attack function of the attack drone. Bakugo's shouts of rage were immediate and followed closely by explosions, and he was effectively distracted from pursuing them and the 1 million points. If Akatani's calculations, and by calculations he meant absolute guesses, but no one needed to know that were correct, Todoroki's team should be approaching. Mr. Icy Hot incoming, 3 o'clock. Shinso called out. Right about then. Akatani squeezed Hatsum and Uraraka's shoulders lightly, the agreed-upon signal for fly away. The team launched upwards, narrowly missed by the electricity Kaminari sent out, and the wave of ice that followed. Todoroki's eyes narrowed at something behind the airborne team, and Akatani barely had time to process that before Bakugo returned with a vengeance, the poor drone now grounded and scorched. Die, you shitty Biasudi. Well, that certainly wasn't ideal. Plan C. He yelped, and the girls turned off the rocket boots, sending them down so Bakugo simply flew overhead. This move, however, merely placed them back within the reach of Team Todoroki. Akatani leaned back as Todoroki's hands swiped at him, barely missing the headbands around his neck. Shinso attempted to help by talking, trying to get one of them under his control, but none of the other team responded, distracted by the intense game of capture the headbands happening above. Their savior came in the form of Bakugo Katsuki, back once more. His attempt to grab the headbands from Akatani were intercepted by a wall Todoroki's ice, turning his attention to Todoroki's team and forcing Todoroki to leave Akatani or lose his own points. Leaving their team to retreat. Distantly, he could hear Present Mix's enthusiastic commentary on the fight, but he tuned him out, sorry Mike, in favor of focusing on the problem of the team's incapability to retreat as their feet were lodged firmly in ice. He looked at the time. 1 more minute. A sudden gust of wind blew past, and he turned to see Team Todoroki standing some feet away, with a handful of their headbands. He reached for his neck and came up empty. Then he noticed the rather large shadow they were in from an ice fixture of some sort. and saw Ida's engine sputter, from what he put together as some sort of special move. An opening. Guys, this might feel a bit weird. Try not to freak out. Akatani said quietly. He'd have to be extremely careful not to hurt any of them. He could possibly only travel himself, but that'd leave him stranded in the air for 2 minutes while his team was trapped in the ice. He didn't want them to lose. Not only for himself, but for his team. The shadows warped. They pulled at him, clung to him, and he felt the chill deep into his bones. The team popped out of a shadow, just within reach of Team Todoroki. Akatani jumped while both teams were in shock at the sudden appearance, pushing aside his lightheadedness at the sheer effort that had taken to channel a bit of one for all, desperately trying not to pour in too much, not to hurt Todoroki. And he could see Todoroki's eyes widen, see him raise his right arm, but Akatani was coming from his left, he couldn't. As he grabbed the headbands, a spark of fire ripples up Todoroki's left arm for a second before flickering out, and Akatani used Ida's shoulders as a springboard to jump back to his team, dodging Yaoyorozu and Kaminari's attempts at grabbing him, getting caught soundly by his team just as the buzzer rang. And that's IE for round 2. In first place, reclaiming the 1 million points, Team Akatani. Akatani felt a smile flit across his face as his team cheered. He listened as Bakugo, Todoroki and someone named Monoma were announced to have also moved on to the tournament round. Hey guys! Akatani said in a breathless voice. He could see black spots in his vision the longer he kept his eyes open. Yeah. Catch me! Akatani passed out to the shouts of alarm from his teammates. Waking up in the infirmary was not a pleasant experience. Akatani could attest to that. After a scolding from Recovery Girl and a handful of gummies, he was sent off to lunch where he was greeted by his friends. He still felt cold, his hands shaking slightly. He'd just gotten a tray of katsudon when his attention was redirected to a certain classmate. Akatani! Todoroki called. Can we talk privately? He titled his head in question but acquiesced, leaving his bowl at the table as he followed Todoroki out into a quiet corridor, smiling to reassure his friends' concerned looks as he left. As they stood, facing each other in the shadowed corridor, Akatani took the opportunity to study the other boy. His hair was split evenly down the middle, which seemed almost unrealistic because it was so perfectly. But one would expect at least some streaks of red in the white or white in the red, but no, perfectly divided down the middle. Briefly, he considered it extremely lucky it had been split left-right instead of front-back. That would look pretty weird. Plus, since his hair color seemed to directly correlate with his quirk, the implications of that kind of split were something. So lost in thought, he nearly jumped when Todoroki broke the silence. You made me break my oath. Sorry? Ignoring his question apology, Todoroki continued. Your power in those last moments. It felt so similar to what I've seen from All Might. Akatani froze, but then adopted a casually blank expression, painting a look of curiosity and confusion on his face. Internally, however, he was back to losing his sheet. How perceptive was Todoroki to realize? Todoroki lifted his head and looked Akatani in the eye. Are you All Might's illegitimate child or something? Akatani choked. Perceptive? What? Then he realized how utterly suspicious that was. Why would you? I certainly wish that were the case. That's so no. And he did wish that were the case. Dearly. Maybe then he wouldn't be running. Maybe then he'd be safe. Todoroki gave him a suspicious look but didn't comment. Is that all? Akatani asked. Also, what's this about an oath? Todoroki looked at him for a moment before he responded. That moment when you came after me in the cavalry battle, I felt so overwhelmed that I broke. I made a promise to myself a long time ago that I'd never use his fire. My father is the pro-hero endeavor. My old man is ambitious, but he was never able to best All Might. He's determined to beat him though, one way or another. Akatani stilled. Have you ever heard of quirk marriages? They were popular back at the dawn of quirks and were clearly unethical, but that didn't stop my old man. He's got plenty of money to throw at his problems and paid off my mother's family so he could get his hands on her quirk. From the moment I was born, he's seen me as a tool to usurp All Might. Akatani felt like hitting himself. He'd heard Dabi's story. He knew this. And he hadn't connected the FING dots. Hadn't realized Dabi's F-2Y's youngest brother was in his class. In every memory I have of my mother, she's crying. She called my left side unbearable before throwing boiling water on my face. The reason I aim to beat you is as a personal triumph. I won't use my father's quirk. I'm going to show him that I reject his power and I can take first place without using it. Todoroki said with finality. Akatani had no idea how to respond to that. But he didn't have to, because Todoroki seemed to be done with his piece and left, leaving Akatani standing alone in the corridor staring at the spot he'd just vacated. Waiting room number 1 was aggressively bland-looking. Akatani stared at the gray walls and lack of decor as he waited for the first match to start, inwardly hating the monotonous gray of the walls, table and chairs. The minimalist aesthetic was strong here. The most colorful things in the room were the dark blue paneling near the ceiling and himself, clad in the standard blue, white and red UA gym uniform. He mentally likened it to a prison cell, with the lack of any flavor or personality. Then again, maybe that's what they were going for. Maybe Dabi's sense of interior design, which consisted of cheap, worn-out and unmatched furniture, only had rubbed off on him too. He wondered what the arena was used for outside of the sports festival. Most likely nothing, considering how utterly rich UA was. In comparison to the vast, city-sized training grounds they had, a single arena was hardly anything. If he strained his ears, he could make out the buzz of the audience, not currently too loud as there was nothing to really cheer for. There was a screen in the corner showing exactly what anyone watching a live record from home would see, but it was silent, Akatani having muted it to help him focus a bit. He sighed into the near silence, if only to fill it with sound for a moment. Akatani wanted to find Todoroki again. To say what, exactly, he had no idea. He couldn't really just walk up and go, "Hey, remember that one brother of yours who went missing and presumably died? Well, we're pals and also he's alive and we're building a case against your shitbag of a father." That probably wouldn't go over super well. He didn't feel right, just leaving their conversation there. He wasn't entirely sure what sort of response Todoroki had been looking for, but that didn't stop the uneasy feeling in his gut at the thought of simply never addressing the conversation again. Whether it was because of a warped sense of guilt for not telling Todoroki he knew sooner and potentially giving him something of a confidant so he wasn't dealing with his problems alone anymore, or just his stupid need to solve every problem he knew about as fast as possible, excluding his own because hypocrisy, much. He didn't know, but he wasn't satisfied with how that had ended. There wasn't really much he could do about it at the moment though. So instead, he focused on the next round of the festival, the tournament. One-on-one battles, the round he knew Shinso needed to win or at least land in the top 3 to join the hero course. If he and Shinso both won all their matches, they'd meet in the final round. He had to admit, he was grateful they weren't facing each other too soon. He didn't really want to fight his friend this early in, would rather they both win more matches and achieve as much of their own goals as possible before they had to face each other and inevitably leave as winner and loser. His first round was going to be against Kirishima. Akatani didn't know him too well, but Kirishima seemed pretty nice of a person overall. He was a bit loud and excitable at times, but he at least knew when to tone it down. He also seemed to be working on befriending Bakugo, which was admirable considering the other boy's absolute denial of any sort of friendship. More importantly though, Kirishima was strong. Akatani hadn't really seen the other boy fighting enough to have a good grip on his fighting style, but just based off of his quirk alone, it probably leaned more towards defensive. Hardening wasn't really an explicitly offensive quirk, though it did likely give an edge over someone without the quirk. He imagined a punch with a rock-hard and somewhat pointy fist would hurt a lot more than one with a regular, squishy fist. His own quirk, that is, his original quirk, shadow travel, was a lot less offensive and a lot more escapist. Great for stealing and quick getaways, not so much for actual combat where he didn't want to dismember his opponent. He could theoretically shadow travel his opponents around multiple times to disorient them, but that seemed both incredibly tiring and also way less practical than just physical fighting. One for all was most definitely offensive in every way. Super strength generally was a bit of an all-rounder type of quirk, but it did come with the slight complication of his tendency to break every bone in his arm whenever he used it. He didn't really want to wind up with permanent nerve damage or lose the use of his arms just yet, so that was off the table. Akatani trusted Recovery Girl's quirk. Really, he did, but he didn't know if it could stop him from losing the function of his arms. Plus, getting shattered arms healed would drain his stamina way too much on top of his already fatigued self, and if he really wanted to progress like All Might wanted, he'd be better off reserving the little energy he had left for his later fights, not squandering it away in the first match and jeopardizing himself later on. It really wouldn't be ideal to collapse in the middle of a match from exhaustion. Before he knew it, he was summoned out to a tunnel that would lead to the arena, left to wait until the announcer called for him to enter the arena. He could hear the rumbling of the thousands of people overhead, and could see the raised platform on which the matches would be held. "Welcome out first fighters." Present Mick's voice echoed through the speakers. "It's the boy with a heart of gold and fists of stone. Welcome Hero Class 1, as Kirishima Ijiro." The crowd cheered as Kirishima presumably walked out, the walls practically shaking with how loud they were. Versus our current reigning champ, landing first place in our last 2 events. Let's see if he can do it again. It's Akatani Mikumo from the Hero Course, Class 1A. He had tried to brace himself, but absolutely nothing could have prepared him for the absolute onslaught of cheers he got as he walked out. He consciously kept his face from showing the shock he was feeling at the crowd's reaction, aware of the cameras on his face and the giant screen broadcasting his every move. The rules are simple: immobilize your opponent or force them out of the ring. You can also win by getting the other person to cry uncle. Akatani sent Kirishima a small, nervous smile as they stood facing each other. "Ready?" Kirishima grinned back, and Akatani matched his stance as he got into ready position, knees slightly bent and dominant foot forwards. "Begin." Neither competitor moved immediately. It seemed Kirishima was also aware of the disadvantage they were left at, considering the nature of their quirks. In the end, Kirishima made the first move, lunging towards Akatani, who spun out of the way of a hardened fist, ducking down right after as Kirishima smoothly threw another punch at him. Akatani experimentally aimed a high kick at the other's head, anticipating the dodge and following up with another kick from the other foot in a butchered sort of spinning kick that actually landed a hit. Considering the ache in his foot from the spot of impact, not dissimilar to the ache when he kicked a brick wall, he wasn't sure that was a good thing. What the next few minutes consisted of was a game of evasion and dodges with the occasional well-placed hit, just so he wasn't only evading and dodging. Akatani did his best to hit unexpectedly, before Kirishima could use his hardening and turn Akatani's own attack into a disadvantage to Akatani. It felt like the fight would go on forever until Akatani managed to maneuver around behind Kirishima and hit what he knew was a nerve cluster before Kirikold hardened himself in defense the brachial plexus, at the side of his neck just under his ear, causing the other to collapse, briefly paralyzed. Akatani was quick to immobilize him, sitting on his back and pinning his legs lest he recover before Akatani could be declared winner. Midnight checked that Kirishima couldn't move for a full 10 seconds before indicating to the announcer's booth that he had, in fact, won. "Kirishima is immobilized, Akatani wins," Mike announced, and Akatani abruptly realized the audience was still there, loud as ever, and he'd been tuning them out. He hastily got up from his perch on Kirishima's back. There was a robotic stretcher which arrived to take Kirishima away to Recovery Girl, probably to let him get unparalyzed? Remobilized? As he left the arena, the ache in his hands and limbs reminded him of his own injuries, mostly because punching a hardened Kirishima was like slamming one's hand into concrete, ill-advised and bound to be regretted. It wasn't too serious though, so he opted to head up to as observation room instead of bothering Recovery Girl with something as minor as split knuckles and bruised knees. Accepting the congratulations with only a bit of embarrassment at the attention and praise, Akatani took a seat with empty seats on each side as the next match proceeded, Todoroki vs. Zero. Present Mike introduced them with just as much grandeur as before, Aizawa interjecting every once in a blue moon. The sight of Todoroki reminded him once more of the weird feeling of both wanting to do or say something without knowing what he was supposed to or even allowed to say. He scrunched up his nose slightly as the feelings and thoughts came back, and pulled out his phone to bother Dabi as a distraction. Runaways Only Club. Bacon Man. What? Bored. Entertain me. Bacon Man. TF, I thought it was something important. This is important. I'm bored, and as the only person I know, you're now legally required to entertain me. Bacon Man. Go eat a cheese grater, brat. I'm lactose intolerant. Bacon Man. I said a cheese grater, not cheese, dumbass. Wouldn't the cheese grater have cheese on it? Bacon Man. No? Why the if? BC. If it didn't, it'd be a regular grater, not a cheese grater. You specifically said cheese grater. Bacon Man. JFC, just go solvitate over quirks or something. Oh, good plan. See, I knew I could count on you. Bacon Man. W. 3. Bacon Man. EW. Okay, thanks, bye. Akatani looked up from his phone only to promptly have to dodge as a glacier nearly sheared off his ear. He stared at the giant chunk of ice centimeters from his face. Alrighty then. Looking down into the arena, he could see Todoroki's lonely form melting the ice Zero was encased in. He could hear the crowd's placations to Zero of it being fine, but he was more focused on Todoroki. He just looked so incredibly sad. Akatani physically felt the need to give him, like, a hug. That probably wouldn't go over very well though. The next match was a Shido against a guy named Monoma. Akatani thought his quirk might have to do with copying. He could vaguely recall him from the cavalry battle, seeing him from the corner of his vision a few times, each time with a wildly different quirk. At first it seemed like an even match, Monoma using a quirk that enlarged his hands and another that turned his limbs into drills, and a Shido holding her own pretty well, but once the 5-minute mark passed, Monoma seemed to focus his tactics more on evasion and maneuvering around a Shido, as opposed to outright attacks. No quirk usage to be seen. With that, it was much less difficult for a Shido to get him out of the ring, leaving her the winner of that match. There was a brief break as Cementos repaired the floor of the ring from the acid damage it had taken during the match, and then the next match proceeded Yaoyorozu against Kendo from 1B. Akatani watched attentively as his friend walked into the ring, facing the other girl. As the match started, Yaoyorozu seemed to emit some kind of gas from her skin, not too dissimilar to that of Midnight's quirk, the gas quickly reaching her opponent, who swayed upon inhalation, collapsing not too soon after. Akatani remembered discussing the possibility of Momo using her quirk like that, but they'd never actually gotten to see whether it was, in fact, possible. So far the matches had been split between extremely quick wins and more drawn-out battles, but he was pretty sure he knew how the next match would go down. As Shinso and Juzu met in the middle of the ring, Akatani could make out Shinso saying something just before Present Mike screamed for them to begin. He watched as Juzu replied, "Not a great move," but it wasn't like he could have known, and stilled in the familiar hold of Shinso's quirk. Akatani had gone under Shinso's control before curiosity and a most likely damaging sense of awe for cool quirks, which was honestly all quirks. And he knew that Juzu's mind must have been filled with fog and a bewildering sense of peace. He theorized that the peaceful feeling was to make those under Shinso's control a bit less resistant to any suggestions he made. It was an interesting feeling, and he was sure it'd be great for calming people down in a hurry. Hey, Present Mike called out, "What's going on here?" The fight has just begun, but Hananuki Juzu is completely frozen. And what's with that look on his face? Could this be a quirk at work? This is a perfect example of why the entrance exam isn't rational. Aizawa spoke up. Akatani perked you at his homeroom teacher's monotone voice. Shinso failed the practical exam to get into the hero course. Since he also applied for general studies, he probably figured that would happen. Akatani watched raptly as the heroic student spun on his heel, walking straight towards the boundary line. What? Huh? Present Mike exclaimed melodramatically. What's this? Juzu is obeying him. He'd personally never seen what someone else looked like when they were being controlled. Akatani sincerely hoped he didn't have the same dumbstruck sort of blank look on his face, but he doubted it. Hitoshi Shinso, his quirk, brainwashing. When his opponent answers a question, it flips a switch in their mind, forcing them to do whatever he says. Not every question does it though, he only brainwashes when he wants to. Akatani froze. And Juzus walked right out of the ring. Akatani listened with half an ear as present Mike announced Shinso the winner, more worried about his previous statements. He'd given away Shinso's quirk. His quirk that, while powerful, was not nearly as effective once his opponents knew how it worked. He skimmed the bracket and felt his stomach drop to his toes. Shinso would be fighting Ida next, if Hatsumei-chan did what he thought she would and let him win by forfeit after advertising her babies. Ida, who was observing the match just as much as he'd been, and who most definitely heard Aizawa and Mick's words on Shinso's quirk. Ida, who was built much more muscular than Shinso, who, while tall as hell, had all the gangle and limbs of a baby giraffe. He didn't mean it in any offensive way, but Shinso was going to get his butt kicked. That didn't speak great odds for his chances of advancing past round 2. Unless he could somehow rile Ida up enough to get him talking, but Akatani had no idea how he'd go about that before Ida just used his speed to push him out of bounds or immobilize him. He worried his lip as he thought about his friend's next match, zoning out for Ida's fight with Mei-chan, only coming back to earth as Uraraka stood, looking a bit queasy. He realized fast why she looked so anxious. Her first match would be against none other than Bakugo. Bakugo, for all his temper and explosive personality would suggest, was honestly probably one of the most skilled and sharp members of 1A. It just didn't seem that way because he chose screaming and aggression over the more traditionally tame behaviors of top students, cough cough Ida cough cough Yamamo. It was easy to forget he was one of the best when he called half the class extras and the other half increasingly insulting and absurd nicknames. Akatani watched with narrowed golden eyes as the match started, Bakugo evading Uraraka's attempts at getting him with her quirk and aiming explosions at the girl. The fight was honestly painful to watch, but he refused to look away. Uraraka simply refused to give up, and he could admire that determination if not applaud it. Bakugo was treating her like a real opponent, too, which the crowd didn't seem to understand until Eraserhead chided them all for both looking down on Uraraka and simultaneously villainizing Bakugo. It was at that moment that Uraraka showed the ace hidden up her sleeve, dropping the ton of rubble she'd slowly and subtly accumulated in the air onto Bakugo. Akatani's jaw almost dropped as Bakugo managed to blow it up in an explosion that sent a wave of heat over his face. There was no way that didn't hurt like a beach. He had to admit, he'd been somewhat unsurprised when Bakugo won. Disappointed, a little, considering how hard Uraraka tried. But it wasn't really a shock that Bakugo won. He was just really good. He found Uraraka in one of the rooms off to the side as Kaminari went against a girl from 1B named Shiozaki. The girl had a bit of gauze on her cheek and some bandages on her arms, but seemed otherwise fine physically. It wasn't really that she was worried about anyways, but rather her emotional state. Hi. His voice sounded hesitant, even to his own ears. Uraraka looked up, and a smile came across her face, but her eyes looked seconds from crying. Oh hey, Akatani-kun. Her voice sounded so incredibly worn out and fragile, even though his friend was anything but. Akatani would be the first to admit that he absolutely SCD at the whole feelings thing. However, he also SED at the whole minding your own business thing, so instead of making a tactical retreat like every bone on his body told him he needed to, he sat beside her and pulled her into a stiff hug, softly patting her head like Dobby did to him. You did so well. He spoke with full honesty, because he was pretty sure she didn't need any insincere platitudes. He hesitated before saying his next words a bit, not sure if they were, in fact, friends mutually but also desperately needing something more to say. I'm proud to call you my friend. Akatani startled a bit as Uraraka's body shook once, twice, before he realized belatedly that she was crying and proceeded to panic. Oh no, did I say something wrong? I'm sorry. I was supposed to comfort you but now you're crying. Oh God, I'm so sorry. Please stop crying. I'm not sure what to do in this situation. Do you need a tissue? Wait, why are you laughing now? Uraraka-san? Are you okay? You're kind of freaking me out. He rambled in a hassle as the girl went from sobbing to tearfully laughing at his suffering. Gradually, she calmed down, no longer laughing but also no longer crying, and the two simply sat in silence together as present mixed commentary echoed through the walls. Eventually, Uraraka spoke up, voice cracked a bit but no longer dejected. USCK at this whole comforting thing. Akatani would have taken offense if it weren't true. He said as much to his friend, who laughed. Her phone ringing took both teens by surprise, and she picked it up to see it was her parents calling. Akatani took the chance to slip away with a wave goodbye as she picked up, closing the door behind him softly. He turned to walk away only to nearly run into a flaming chest inches from his face. He froze for a fraction of a second before slowly looking up as the chest gave way to a neck, which area remains to a face, one incredibly familiar despite him having never met the man before. Endeavor and Akatani Mikumo stared at one another in the relatively quiet of the corridor. Endeavor smelled like a campfire and not in a fun way. He also was flaming in multiple places indoors, which was probably a safety hazard. He was also staring down at Akatani. Not for the first time, and certainly not for the last, he cursed his height. You. Endeavor spoke. Me. Akatani echoed automatically. Endeavor frowned. Akatani wanted to punch him. You're the one who beat Shudo in the last 2 rounds. He observed. Yes, and what of it? He probably shouldn't be so blasé in his replies. He was definitely coming off as rude. He did not, however, particularly care. Endeavor narrowed his eyes. You've proven to be strong competition. My Shudo has a duty to surpass All Might. His match against you will be an excellent test. So do your best not to make a disgraceful match. With that, the flame hero continued on his way, not a single farewell to be heard. Akatani stood for a moment, whether he was dumbstruck or frozen with rage he wasn't sure, as the man's heavy footsteps faded from his hearing, going down the corridor. He didn't have time to decide how he felt before he was once more summoned to the arena for his next match. Todoroki. He was still conflicted about what to do regarding the boy. Ideally, he'd get his father arrested as soon as possible and they'd deal with the trauma afterwards. Practically, that probably wasn't possible, not just due to who his father was but also due to Akatani's terrible impatience when it came to helping. If he did eventually submit the case against Endeavor, it'd still take time to be actually investigated and even more time to actually have any legal action occur, mainly because he was the number 2 hero and would no doubt have incredibly strong lawyers. That time was much too long, especially considering how long Todoroki had already been trapped in a house with that flaming shitbag. Who knew what kind of repercussions it'd have on Todoroki if he was stuck with Endeavor for that much longer with the same not great mindset he had? It was clear that he needed to use his quirk in its fullest form, if not because it expanded his options in a pinch then because not doing so literally physically hurt him. The question then lay in how the hell he was supposed to convince the stubborn boy to use his DMN quirk. As he stood across from Todoroki in the ring, he tuned out present mic again. Sorry Mike? To focus on Todoroki and Todoroki only. Todoroki stared right back with a neutral expression. As soon as the word, begin, left present Mick's mouth, Akatani jumped forwards, just as Todoroki sent out a wave of ice to send him back. The closer he stayed to the center, the less he'd have to worry about boundary lines and the more he could focus on avoiding getting immobilized. The unexpected move forwards left him in extremely close proximity to Todoroki's face. Way closer than comfortable in a normal situation, but Akatani hardly noticed, instead aiming a punch at the other boy's stomach. He could be embarrassed about that later. Todoroki took barely a few seconds to recover before he was back at it again with spikes of ice that Akatani dodged around to the best of his ability, unfortunately creating more distance between the two as he fought not to get impaled. Is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to. Todoroki Shudo was irritated. Akatani persistently dodged all his attacks, even landing a few hits on him. Though, he supposed if he was irritated, his father must be absolutely enraged. That would normally satisfy him, if he weren't still so annoyed with the golden-eyed boy. In quick succession, he released a cluster of icy spikes once more, throwing the other bog off balance as he nimbly navigated around the new fixtures while also taking into consideration the ice already formed on the stone floors from his previous attacks. Taking advantage of the moment, he aimed one of his largest ice attacks this match at his opponent, certain Akatani wouldn't be able to recover in time to dodge. He had not expected him to break apart the ice with super strength. Shielding his face from the fragments of ice flung his way by the powerful gust of cold wind produced, Todoroki was quick to generate ice behind him, narrowly avoiding the boundary lines as the wind died down. Narrowing his eyes, he sent out another row of ice, only for Akatani to dodge, again, this time running right at him. Todoroki threw up a decent-sized ice shield between them to deter the other boy, not anticipating that he'd break through it, aiming a high kick at his head they're connected, sending Todoroki reeling to the side, cheekbone aching as he sent out a smaller blast of ice that Akatani practically swatted aside, kneeing him in the stomach harshly. Todoroki used a blast of ice under his feet to create some distance between the two so he could recollect himself. The two stood for a moment on opposite sides of the ring, both breathing heavily, each exhalation creating a visible puff of air in the chilly arena. They both dove back into the fight as one, Akatani running past the blast of ice Todoroki sent out and sliding under the punch aimed his way, sticking out a leg as he went and bringing Todoroki down too. He pinned him, and spoke in a voice much softer than his cold expression would suggest. "You're shivering, Todoroki." Todoroki kicked him off of him and sent out another large blast of ice that was once more broken with a flick of two fingers. He felt his eyes widen at the sight of two broken fingers, purple and limp in a way fingers should most definitely not be. "It'd help if you used your fire." Todoroki's eyes flashed at the words, anger finally piercing through the blank expression he normally wore like a mask. "My father put you up to this, didn't he?" He growled, stomping and releasing another wave of ice that was once more shattered, along with Akatani's ring finger. "Your father didn't tell me to do sheet. I can see you shaking from way over here. You're hurting yourself, and for what? To prove a point?" Akatani ran forwards again, grabbing Todoroki's arm and flinging him further into the ring. Todoroki grunted as he hit the floor harshly, ice fragments embedding themselves into his exposed forearms as he rolled. "I won't use," he sent out a wave of ice that Akatani dodged, his quirk. "I'll be the #1 hero using just my mother's power." "You dumb it's your quirk, not his. You aren't proving sheet if you put yourself out of commission before you graduate. Do you even want to be a hero?" Akatani said, his face twisted in emotion, and Todoroki froze, memories flooding back. "It's okay, Shudo. You can be a hero. Is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to." Akatani watched as Todoroki's left side lit up in flames, a crazed smile making its way across his face. "How can you be smiling in this situation?" Todoroki asked, and Akatani's grin widened. It was true, Akatani's fingers were absolutely throbbing, and he was most likely shaking from the cold, and he most certainly has at least 3 bleeding wounds from razor-sharp icicles grazing him. He was also facing Todoroki at his full potential, the same Todoroki who could freeze entire 5-story building at half power without breaking a sweat. "But you're using your fire," he said softly, knowing the words would carry in the momentary silence. Todoroki blinked at that, and gave an almost soft look in return, looking down at his flaming left side. "Yeah, I am." He looked up once more, eyes filled with a spark that Akatani hadn't seen before. "Let's finish this." He nodded. "With everything we've got?" Todoroki huffed what might have been a laugh. "That goes without saying." Akatani readied his arm, one for all flowing into him easily, filling his arm and legs with a familiar buzzing energy. "On 3. Todoroki nodded. 1. They ran forward as one. The cement cracked under Akatani's feet as he launched himself forwards once more. 2. He could just barely make out the panicked shouts of Midnight and Present Mike in the background, telling them to stop. Neither one did. 3. Plowing through the cement walls thrown between them, they met in an explosion of power and light, and the world went white. Akatani, just before they met, could have sworn he'd heard a quiet, "Thank you," from the other boy. Is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to. When Todoroki opened his eyes, he was greeted with a bright blue sky overhead and the feeling of grass under his body. And Todoroki is out of bounds. Akatani wins. Midnight announced as he pushed himself into his elbows, catching sight of a familiar head of fluffy black hair in the ring, near his own side of the arena and extremely close to the boundary lines, boy just barely staying within them. Akatani looked around a moment, seemingly disoriented, before his eyes landed on Todoroki. He watched as the other boy stumbled over to him, arriving at his side with minimal falls. He blinked at the hand held out to him, the intimidating boy from the ring gone and replaced with regular, everyday Akatani. It took a moment to realize what Akatani was doing, and he hesitantly grasped the other's hand, letting out a grunt as he was pulled to his feet swiftly. Akatani didn't let go of his hand, rather, he used it to wrap Todoroki's arm around his own shoulder, taking half his weight. He could distantly hear present Mike say something or another about sportsmanship, but it was distantly, as though through a tunnel. Oki. Todoroki. Akatani was saying his name. He realized they'd stopped walking, when had they started, the other boy now looking into his eyes, much too close. Akatani had really nice eyes. Golden. He also had nice eyelashes. Oh, you have a concussion, I'm gonna take you to recovery, girl. Oh, he'd still been talking. Akatani's ears were also turning an interesting shade of pink. He wondered if they were warm. In a blur, he found himself nodding off, only to jolt awake as they stopped again. He blinked, looking for the source of disturbance. He glimpsed his father just barely before his eyes protested at the strain of looking up, and he let them fall half-closed once more. He could hear bits and pieces of the conversation between Akatani and Endeavor. Not because of you. Insolent child. His own person, not another you. Why, son? Have to get going now. Good day. I said good day. Akatani? Interrupted forcefully, and they were off once more. Todoroki passed out. Then, but he could barely recall the feeling of happiness? As they walked away, leaving his father behind. Is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to. Akatani was a bit worried for Todoroki. He didn't think he'd hit him that hard, but the boy had been absolutely loopy before he'd passed out, slurring something about his eyelashes before his eyes rolled back. His own injuries weren't that bad in his opinion, he'd certainly had worse, but Recovery Girl and All Might disagreed, a mixture of scolding and begging from the two for him to never do something like that again. He didn't particularly plan to again, permanently damaging his nerves wasn't something he planned on doing, but they were insistent, and so he did promise to not use his quirk like that again except as a very, very last resort. This time had been an exception. Todoroki had needed it. He wouldn't do it again. He didn't understand the look All Might had given him. A mix of exasperation and what might have been pride? Nonetheless, he didn't mention it as the skeletal man ruffled his hair gently before heading out. Apparently the next match was postponed while Cementos repaired the arena, which was horribly damaged from the absolute firefight of the last match. Akatani was just sitting on the cot beside Todoroki's, who was briefly conscious after Recovery Girl fixed him up before the rapid loss of stamina kicked in and he passed out again, this time from tiredness when the door to the infirmary burst open, a flood of his classmates pouring in. He blinked as Uraraka, Ida, Yaoyorozu, Kirishima, Tsuyu, Shiro, Ashido, Kaminari, Mei-chan and Shinso poured in, almost getting stuck in the doorway. There were more people still outside, but the infirmary was evidently not meant to hold that many people at once. What are you guys doing here? He asked when nobody spoke for a moment, instead taking in his arm wrapped in a cast and fingers covered in bandages, legs also in casts and gauze on his face. Todoroki didn't look too much better, although he was free of any broken limbs. We're here to see you, Uraraka said cheerfully, although her eyes were roaming, taking in the injuries. But I'm fine. He tilted his head at the huff he heard from Shinso. He was fine. Well, we didn't know that. All we saw were you two duking it out, and then there was an explosion and we couldn't see anything, and by the time the dust cleared up you were both gone. Mina interjected, earning nods of agreement from the others. He supposed that did make sense. Yeah, that was ridiculous. You two looked like you were gonna kill each other. Kaminari added, and Akatani paused. Had they? Sure, the fight had gotten a little heated, but wasn't that an exaggeration? Before anyone could say anything more, Recovery Girl appeared, shooing the visitors out under the threat of absolutely nothing, but they left all the same because she could be scary when she wanted to. Something was mildly terrifying about a 3'9" woman coming after you with a cane and a gentle yet firm scolding that would inevitably leave you feeling terribly guilty. Not that Akatani was speaking from experience. Once he was about as healed as he could get without also passing out like Todoroki, he was free to watch the rest of the matches, albeit while Recovery Girl watched like a hawk over his shoulder to see that he did, in fact, eat the gummies she'd given him. They were fruit-flavored and probably had at least a little caffeine for the immediate effect they had. He kinda wanted her recipe. Yaoyorozu and Ashido fought, Yaoyorozu winning the seemingly endless match by maneuvering them around subtly and slowly, eventually getting Ashido out of bounds. She didn't use the gas trick again, which confirmed Akatani's theory that it'd probably be a bit more difficult to focus on creating individual molecules of gas in gastric form. It was probably better that way too, a good way to show versatility in fights. The next pairing, Shinso and Ida, unfortunately had Shinso lose, Ida keeping a firm clamp over his mouth and refusing to respond to a single word Shinso said. Ida was remarkably quick to get Shinso out of bounds, and Akatani felt torn on whether to be disappointed Shinso had lost or happy that Ida would progress. Bakugo against Shiozaki was interesting. They had such incredibly different personalities, one a gentle worshipper of God and the other Bakugo, but were both powerhouses with their quirks. In the end, Bakugo won after a particularly cleverly aimed explosion that knocked Shiozaki out. Akatani had a hard time convincing Recovery Girl he was good to continue, in the end having to promise not to use one for all at all, Recovery Girl sending all might accusatory looks the whole conversation as though to say, this is your fault. So there he was. In the arena, standing across from Yaoyorozu. His arm was bundled up still, him having asked Recovery Girl to put more focus on healing his legs so he could use those to fight. She probably could have healed him near completely, but that would have drained him too much and he did want to continue. If he was going to participate properly, he was going to go all out. He could imagine the disgusted look Dobby would give him for that, the crispy boy much more of a half-asser unless it was like life or death to him. As Present Mike called for the match to start, he charged forwards, closing the distance between the two opponents as fast as he could and throwing a kick at her head that just barely missed as she dodged. He found it most effective to initiate close combat early on, as that was where he excelled. Yamamoto, however, was also brilliant at close combat, and so began another long battle. Akatani was pretty sure all of his fights had been the drawn-out sort. The back and forth between the two was intense, Yaoyorozu generating small weapons frequently, unable to form anything bigger than a bow staff before Akatani was back in her face, not letting her breathe in peace without getting kicked in the face. He knew that if he gave her the chance, she'd make something like a sticky bomb or a net gun that would immobilize him immediately. It was a bit of luck and a lot of subtle strategy that eventually named Akatani the winner. For the majority of his attacks and almost all of his defense, he'd been using solely his legs for kicks, blocks, and other such attacks. Doing so the whole time had shifted Yamamoto's attention to his legs, leaving her less focused on attacks from elsewhere. Namely his battered arms. With a fast chop to the neck, exactly like what he did to Kirishima, she was down, Akatani plopping down on top of her back for 10 seconds before he was declared winner. As soon as it was announced, he quickly got off of her back, the girl recovering from the temporary paralysis a bit faster than Kirishima had and standing, a hint of disappointment at her loss in her eyes before she congratulated him on the win with a kind smile. The two walked side by side to Recovery Girl, who healed Yamamoto of the small bruises and cuts she'd collected and Akatani of a little more of his shattered fingers, giving both of them more gummies and instructing Yaoyorozu to eat something in the meantime. Todoroki was gone by then, having woken up in the time between their match and Akatani's return to the infirmary. The two returned to the spectator stands and were greeted with congratulations for making it as far as they both did. Kirishima gave him a high five, which was cool. Akatani took a seat between Uraraka and the wall, Uraraka thankfully more focused on a conversation with Hakigure in her other side than any conversation with him. He was much too tired to do any sort of social interaction. He went over the bracket in his head. Next would be Bakugo and Ida, if his memory was correct. They'd be a good match, most likely. Just then, Present Mic's voice came over the speakers. It seems Ida Tenya has pulled out of the competition due to personal reasons. So now, we'll be proceeding to the final match. Akatani's brows furrowed. Personal reasons? What had happened for Ida to drop out of the competition so suddenly? He didn't have time to ponder as he was ushered down to the arena once more for the final round. He just hoped it wasn't anything too terrible. His hopes were, as per usual, absolutely futile. By the time he was across from Bakugo in the ring, he was honestly ready to crawl into bed. He blamed Endeavor. Regardless, as the match started and Bakugo blasted towards him, he flipped the mental switch in his head into what he called combat mode, and dodged, spinning twice to avoid the second blast aimed at his gut. He feinted a punch with his not-broken arm, following up with an actual kick that nailed Bakugo in the face. He was forced to jump back to avoid getting his face fried off. Didn't want to be accused of copying Dabi. There was only one bacon man allowed at a time, and Akatani wasn't him. A grunt escaped his lips as an explosion hit him in the stomach and back in quick succession, and he retaliated with a roundhouse kick that sent Bakugo reeling. They didn't speak a word, more focused on kicking each other's but than making conversation. Unless one counted Bakugo screaming, "Die!" aggressively as conversation. Akatani personally did not. Given that he was forbidden from using one for all for the time being and there were decidedly no shadows to be seen, Akatani was once more stuck with evading blasts and striking quickly. He was beginning to see a pattern. The fight seemed like it was going to be another endless fight, neither gaining the upper hand and both persistent in both attacks and defenses. Until Bakugo managed to get behind him, hand grazing the back of his neck. The touch was horribly reminiscent of another touch, one that spoke of pain and punishment, one that had once made him scream. In that moment of weakness, as is no Akatani, he was Akatani, froze off just a second, Bakugo struck, managing to throw him off balance with a well-placed explosion and, without giving him a moment to recover, flipped him over his shoulder. His back hit the ground hard, and he barely processed the loud declaration from Present Mic of Bakugo being the winner, too busy calming his heartbeat, hiding the shake to his hands, pushing back the memories that begged to be let out. And out of bounds. Is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to is almost equal to. The awards ceremony was only slightly less rewarding than the single congratulatory text he got from Dabi. The second place podium had a nice view, although he could do without the somewhat sulky Bakugo mere feet away. Apparently he didn't consider his win a real win. Bakugo had caught on to the fact that Akatani had not been entirely there in the moment he'd claimed victory, and that was enough for him to consider it a fake win. Ida wasn't there, and so Yamamo was the only one on the third-place platform, graciously accepting the bronze medal and hug All Might gave her. Akatani hadn't known what to expect when All Might approached him with silver disappointment, maybe? But all he could see in those glowing blue eyes was pride and fondness as he placed the medal over his head, pulling him in lightly for a hug, murmuring a quiet, "Well done," before pulling away and approaching Bakugo with the gold. Bakugo, ever the rebellious Pomeranian, snatched the medal before All Might had the chance to place it over his head, huffing at the congratulations the hero gave for his win. With a final round of applause and a series of backslaps and hair ruffles from his classmates, the sports festival drew to a close at last. And somewhere, someplace, a figure replayed a reel of a certain dark-haired boy with golden eyes and a bright grin, a cruel smile crawling across his face in the dark room. "Found you, Izuken." The day after the sports festival found Akatani curled up in his beanbag with his laptop and his notebook, watching a recording of the festival and finally able to properly take notes on all his classmates' quirks, as well as any other quirks he could see. He actually ended up filling 2 books and making a heady dent in the third, only pausing to replay some clips and stretch out cramped hands. He found himself in awe at the innovative ways some of his peers applied their quirks. He also found himself laughing on the inside more often than not. Ciro using his tape to Tarzan his way across the pit of doom was extremely entertaining to watch. He was only a bit disappointed at the lack of aggressive yodeling on his part. Dabi had stopped by last night for celebratory ramen and mild ribbing for only placing second, although that was edged with real concern. He knew Dabi had most definitely caught his slip of composure in those last few moments. The same one that Bakugo had seen. He brushed off the concern for the most part, instead smoothly directing his attention to his conversation with the Todorokis. Dabi had been steaming mad literally at the elder Todoroki, and mostly amused as Akatani regaled his absolute befuddlement at how in the hell to respond to being dumped on with the weight of a whole tragic backstory. The fried criminal left in the late hours of the night with a hair ruffle that was received with only minimal protests. In other news, however, Akatani also now knew the reason for Ida's abrupt departure yesterday, and he could have kicked himself for not giving it much thought. The hero killer, Stain. Not much was known of the man, aside from his list of atrocities, ranging from murder to near murder. His motives were interesting. He supposedly killed fake heroes, and Akatani wondered if he took requests, a certain flaming trash heap in mind. Naturally, he ended up looking into Stain a bit more, reading up on his previous attacks and areas he'd struck before. The general theme seemed to be striking lone heroes in deserted and dark alleyways, like some sort of modern boogeyman. He hadn't struck more than a few times in one city before moving to the next, and so far his hunting grounds, and wasn't that a thought, someone literally hunting heroes, looked to be Hosu. However, he didn't see what the criteria for a fake hero actually was. Ingenium had been, as far as he knew, a pretty and good hero, keen on helping people, kind and diligent. So had a lot of the other heroes, though, and he didn't like to say it, he supposed some of them could be considered as less of heroes and more of celebrities. Still didn't justify literally murdering them, but it wasn't like he'd get to tell that to the vigilante. Oh yes he would. Fool. He was, frankly, blatantly pushing aside his mild panic attack from the day prior in favor of being semi-productive. As his saying went, work now, mental breakdown as later as possible. Later he could crash and burn, but for now he was on a roll. He'd leave addressing his feelings to future him. Some hours on his computer, minor damage to his eyesight, and a bowl of salad later found him donning the familiar getup of Hikage, nearly poking an eye out attempting to get the right contacts in. Nearly. Fluffing out his gray wig and inspecting his knives 5 today, each sharpened and cleaned with borderline methodical precision and care, he deemed himself fit for sleuthing and headed out, putting on his hood as almost an afterthought. The walk to Hikage's usual haunts was plagued with his own thoughts, most of which he forcibly stuffed into the little box in the back of his mind reserved for things he didn't like thinking about and didn't want or need on his mind. He did, however, let his mind wander on the topic of the League of Villains, and the lack of activity from them as a whole since their single attack on the USJ. It was of course possible that they were a one-and-done situation, had joined together for one mission and then disbanded upon failure. But he didn't think that was the case. Their single-mindedness and dedication to killing All Might was way too potent to be dissuaded by one failed attempt. Any further consideration on the matter was halted as he entered the shabby building, instantly greeted with the sounds of jeers and cheers as a fight proceeded in one of the rings of fire quirk and some sort of strength augmentation. What a pair! And he discreetly glanced around with hooded eyes till he spotted Kitsune's familiar green hair, the woman talking to some patrons idly, pointed teeth glinting in the lights. As he was about to make his way over most likely through a full circle of the room and multiple detours while looking suitably meandering and aimless, he caught the tail end of a conversation as two people walked past. New shipment of the drag, overhaul wants more intel on the effects. Yeah, when are we meant to meet the kid? Soon enough, and please, for the sake of professionalism, it's customer, not kid. He couldn't hear the response to that as the two walked out of his range of hearing. It was only deeply ingrained instincts that stopped him from straight up following them then and there, his years of spying and common sense telling him exactly how suspicious that would be the only thing keeping him grounded to the floor as they passed, eyes barely lingering on them to keep up the facade, just long enough to memorize their dark but fancy clothes, and the bird-like masks on their faces. Overhaul? A drag? A child? Whatever this was had his attention now. His information on overhaul was limited. The Yakuza boss he'd set off a while ago had, in fact, been said man, but he'd never actually met him. The only thing he'd done was intercept a drag deal, and it hadn't even been the experimental drags he was apparently about to release to the public, just some generic low-quality narcotics. He hadn't had the time to investigate further before Dobby put him on house arrest, and then he'd kinda just forgotten? Now, however, Overhaul was dealing experimental drags to kids, which had just so many problems. Promptly abandoning his initial reasons for coming, he set his sights on following those two as surreptitiously as possible, slipping out of the back door after them and melting into the shadows. Literally. Shadow travel, he found, had two primary uses. You could use the shadows as a doorway, as he most commonly did, jumping from place to place in one move, or you could use them as a thick veil, gliding along just behind the shadows, fully aware of everything going on around you, invisible to anyone but yourself and perhaps someone with mental powers. As he glided along behind the two men, he observed. They'd stopped their conversation in favor of silence, and he took note of the bag one of the two carried. The bag was a mockery of a doctor's briefcase, going quite well with the plague doctor aesthetic they seemed to be going for. He assumed that was where these new drags were stored. He also decided they wouldn't be keeping that bag. Speeding up his glide, he moved ahead of the men, spotting in the distance the nervous figure of a kid, no older than maybe 13 or 14, presumably their customer. The two men had yet to see the kid, but it was only a matter of time, and so, with all the consideration of 3 seconds, Akatani returned to the pair, and, in quite possibly the worst bout of decision-making he'd ever had, jumped out of the shadows, nabbed the briefcase and jumped back in. He floated in the abyss for a second, the feel of the cool leather of the briefcase in his hands a reminder that he actually did that. Dobby was going to kill him. It took the two a moment to register what had happened, and when they did they whirled around, greeted only with the dimly lit and heavily shadowed alleyway. Akatani didn't stay to hear there. Shouting, once more gliding ahead through the shadows until he was hovering behind the boy. While he wanted to leave the scene as soon as possible, he also really didn't want to leave the kid for them to find, so in another well-thought-out move, he nabbed the kid too. The kid seemed too stunned at the sudden change in scenery to move, which Akatani used to properly shadow travel to another alley nearby, but far enough from the Yakuza members to ensure he wouldn't get gutted, shoving the kid out and jumping back into the darkness, popping out in the safety of his warehouse. For a moment he just stood there and let the sheer dumbassery he'd pulled sink in just enough for him to recognize that Lady Luck had definitely played a hand if he'd done that without a hitch, probably looking like a lagging animation for the stillness of his body as he stared straight ahead. Slowly, he turned to look at the briefcase he still clutched with a death grip that put Kendo from 1B to shame. The briefcase, to its credit, didn't at least spout tentacles and strangle him. It just sat there, a leather monument to his sins. He dropped it like it was on fire. Oh yeah, Dobby was definitely going to kill him. Dobby did not, in fact, kill him. He did, however, flick him in the forehead and give him the most world-weary stare he'd ever seen, but that was pretty tame. He knew by now not to expect anything less. Yami, you are the smartest little dumbass I've ever met, and it's a effing miracle you've made it this far in life without getting yourself shot. He gave him a considering look and amended his statement. Actually, no, you're the type to survive a bullet to the head, you FING cockroach. Oh, thanks, I knew you cared. The reckless endangerment to society squealed. Dobby took the liberty to throw a pillow at his head before focusing in on the briefcase. It's not chipped, is it? He sent a look at the bag sitting on the floor between them. Akatani shook his head. No, and I checked at least 5 times. It's a pretty nice bag, actually. Vintage leather, fancy buckles. He was right on that end at least. However, please tell me you at least looked at the drags before admiring the quality of the FNG bag. Akatani nodded, pulling out a small black case. Opening it up revealed a line of needles, each one equipped with a small vial of fluid. There were 7 in total, one was missing. As far as I can tell, they're not your typical hallucinogen or anything like that. I think they're meant to interfere with quirks, but the chemical formula isn't the same as trigger. I don't actually know enough about chemistry to say anything more, so I was hoping you might know someone who does. Dabi arched a brow, a bit miffed. What, you don't think I might know enough about chemistry to help? Akatani, ever a little sheet, snorted. If you did, you'd have more money. A meth lab is something I absolutely would not put past you. He did have a point there. I'll see what I can do. What are you gonna do with the rest of the samples? No idea. Probably not sell them. Know how safe they are to be dumped. For now I'll just keep them. If you get arrested for possession of unknown drags, I'm not bailing you out. That was a lie and they both knew it. Well, maybe not bail him out, but breaking him out was on the table for sure. Or maybe he could acquire a certain flaming trash bag's credit card, put bail back on the table. Possibly a card. All Might themed with bedazzled wheels. He said as much to Akatani. The car bit, of course, not the bail bit. If he gave any more indication that he might care, the boy might actually combust. Or worse, take it as an invitation to call him for every weird inconvenience he came across. If he got called one more time because of a goddamn squirrel breaking into the warehouse, he might go mad. After Dabi left, Akatani didn't have much to do. He couldn't really do anything with the drags he'd stolen, so he shoved them into the fancy bag and the bag under a beanbag chair and considered the matter over and done with. Overhaul, as he'd found, was currently under the investigation of Sir Naitai's agency. Of course, this wasn't common knowledge he'd needed to break out the trusty, illegal activities laptop and put his hacking skills to use, but what he'd found wasn't promising. Apparently, Overhaul was a meticulous BSRD and would be hard to convict for the sheer lack of any solid and plausible evidence. What a pain. Munching on some chicken and going through a simple workout, he took a break from thinking for a little. After all, he had a whole weekend to do that. Joy. He felt oddly unsettled, and he wasn't sure if it was the experimental drags, the serial-killing vigilante roaming the streets of Hosu, or the less-than-stellar ending of the sports festival a day prior. Either way, there wasn't much that could be done, so he put them aside and shoved his uneasy feelings down by focusing on watching the second year's tournament, ignoring the growing feeling of dread in his gut. The Monday after the festival found Akatani heading to school disgustingly early in the pouring rain, hair plastered to his forehead and face dripping wet as he walked in, having foregone shadow travel that morning and also not owning an umbrella. The feeling of rain against his head was somewhat cathartic, which he'd needed, as the uneasy feeling persisted throughout the weekend, leaving him jittery and even more sleepless than usual. Luckily his concealer was waterproof. He was greeted with an empty classroom, which struck him as odd until he remembered. Ingenium. Ida might not be in today. He was proven wrong less than a minute later, when said boy charged through the door with only a little bit less vigor than usual, absolutely no light behind his eyes and an aura of intense sadness and rage. He watched in silence as his friend headed to his seat, acknowledging Akatani with only a nod. Ida-kun. He started, voice carrying a tone of something. The boy turned to him at the sound of his voice, and, sensing the mood, spoke up. I assure you I am fine, Akatani-san. Please do not worry. Akatani sighed, stood, and with great care, pulled the other boy into a hug, plopping his head on Ida's shoulder with only mild tippy-toeing, wrapping his arms securely around his friend. Ida froze, arms unmoving at his sides. Akatani, unbothered by the lack of response, rubbed his chin on Ida's shoulder before speaking. You, he said, are not fine. And that's okay. You don't have to be. Akatani-san. He stopped, huffed and started again. Just don't do anything stupid, okay? Promise me you won't do anything stupid. He pulled back to look him in the eye. Ida trailed off. I apologize, but I can't promise you that. He was surprised to see the unsurprised look on Akatani's face. I know. I didn't expect you to. But try to think things through a bit, okay? Don't go running into trouble. Try. They headed back to their respective seats before Akatani called out to him. And Ida-kun? Yes. It's not your fault. Ida didn't respond. Akatani didn't think he would. They sat in silence as the next few people streamed in, and the next, and as the class was filled with its usual chatter, the 18 other students noticing but not mentioning the utter stillness of the two. Akatani was surprised to see he topped the chart with the most internship offers, followed closely by Bakugo and Todoroki. He hadn't thought he'd done anything overtly impressive, but the lack of remarks from the rest of the class indicated otherwise. Bakugo's hands were popping with mini explosions, though, red eyes boring into the board like he could activate telekinetic pyrokinesis by sheer force of will. Flipping through the options, he wondered how he'd actually decide. Objectively, he should keep in mind what they had to offer to him, as well as what he actually needed to most help on, but he also wanted to keep in mind what he'd probably learn at school and what he would want more outside help on. As well as considering what kind of hero he wanted to be. A top 10 hero wouldn't do if he wanted to go underground, but did he really want to go underground? He also would have to decide if he wanted to focus on shadow travel or one for all, or maybe skills that didn't involve his quirk at all. Additionally, he had to consider what they'd likely have him actually do, especially since he wanted more hands-on experience. He was forcibly removed from his spiraling thoughts as Aizawa called for their attention, only for him to be interrupted by the arrival of Midnight, and with her, the pending sense of doom that came with deciding hero names was too distracting to allow much more consideration into internships. Akatani took the whiteboard handed to him, absent-mindedly thanking whoever was handing them out, mind churning through options. For some reason, this whole hero thing hadn't seemed like a real thing he was doing until now, when he was undeniably faced with a major moment in his career, and now he was too busy having an existential crisis to actually focus on choosing a name. Vabi were here. W. Scribbling onto his board, he hardly registered Aoyama, Ashido and Ajui's turns as he scrawled out the only name he could possibly go by. He waited patiently until it was down to him, Todoroki, Ida and Bakugo to present their names before he went up. The class burst into mutters as he revealed his chosen name. Midnight raised an eyebrow. The hidden hero, Yamikumo. Yamikumo? As in reckless? Are you sure, Akatani-kun? Midnight questioned, getting a soft nod in response. It has. Blue fire. Insults veiling affection. The comforting smell of smoke and ash. A personal meaning. He didn't elaborate. Midnight sent him back to his seat with only a little bit of hesitance. He considered it a win. As it turned out, he hadn't needed to worry too much about how to choose a hero to intern with. He'd have to thank All Might for that later. Gran Torino. His mentor's mentor. He wondered what he was like, to have All Might looking afraid. He didn't think the man was particularly terrible or cruel, for All Might to recommend him. He didn't think All Might would knowingly send him to someone overtly horrible. Hopefully. Probably. He'd be fine. Lunchtime presented him with the uncomfortable clench in his gut at the hollow presence of Ida, who would reply if spoken to, but otherwise remained unengaged in the idle conversation, not even reacting as Kirishima broke the corner off of a table nearby with his head. Uraraka, Yaoyorozu and Tsuyu kept conversation afloat, with Akatani adding in his own 2 cents every now and then, but they couldn't help the glances shot at Ida when he remained silent. Even at times they knew he'd usually interject. He didn't think Ida noticed, and if he did, he didn't say it. Akatani left midway through lunch in favor of hunting down Shinso, whose signature purple hair he'd seen passing by the cafeteria. Shinso! The boy turned, at first confused at the sound of his own name, confusion which quickly shifted to recognition, to a sort of resigned weariness that he'd only seen in the likes of Aizawa, Dabi and himself. He did, however, still stop and wait for him to catch up, so Akatani didn't take it as too serious. Ugh! Akatani grinned. Ugh me. He agreed. Shinso smiled a bit before asking. So, what do you want? Akatani grinned wider, and Shinso leaned back. What else but to see my bestest friend in the whole world? A raised eyebrow. Bestest isn't a word, and you've known me for like a week. Yes, and? Shinso sighed. Never mind. Come on. Akatani said abruptly, pulling Shinso along by his hand. WTF-. Where are we going? He tried to ignore the heat in his face as Akatani pulled him along, walking fast enough to leave him stumbling to catch up. Mei-chan wants to see us. Mei-chan, wait, handsome? Yes, do keep up. Why? Science. She had an idea. They turned a corner. He vaguely recognized the hall as the one leading down to the support classes. Why does that spark fear in me? Don't worry, soon enough nothing will. What the F does that mean? Soon. He was cut off as they arrived at the door to support class 1F, where a certain mad inventor awaited. Goldie. And you brought along Ibags-kun. Ibags-kun? She ignored him. Wonderful. You too can test my new baby. Wait, hold up, when did I agree to this? Hatsum looked at him. You followed Goldie. You're now involved. That only sounds mildly terrifying, thanks. Akatani interjected. Come on Shinso-kun, it'll be fun. There's only a slight chance of maiming, not even that big. Somehow I'm less reassured than before. He deadpanned. Oh hush, you don't have to. The main reason I brought you here was to get you and Hatsum reintroduced. We already met? Shinso said, though it came out as a question. Hatsum rolled her eyes, undoubtedly impatient and eager to get back to her inventions. Yes, thus the do keep up. Akatani plowed on, ignoring their side conversation. I think she can help you out with gear for your hero costume. Shinso did a double take. Hero costume? I'm not even in the course yet. Akatani's eyes glinted ominously. Yet. That's a bit creepy, you know. Shinso tilted his head. But I'm in. Akatani beamed, blinding him and cleansing him of all his sins with the sheer light and pureness he radiated. Hatsum cackled, only sounding a little unhinged and mad scientist-esque. Shinso had the creeping feeling that he'd made a horrible mistake. He couldn't find it in himself to care. Akatani returned home from school a little late and more than a bit singed from testing May's babies after school. He was, however, quite satisfied with the results of their experimentation and testing, finding himself incredibly proud of the chest plate they'd made, capable of withstanding most any damage and absorbing a certain level of kinetic energy, which could then be emitted from the device and used as an extra boost or attack. It was, as the kids called it these days, pretty f***ing rad. He flicked on the lights of the warehouse and flung his bag onto the floor, heading to the fridge while tugging his tie off. He'd been plagued once more with that unsettled feeling once he'd left the distraction of the support lab, and he wanted a snack to help him relax. He grabbed a pre-made parfait and spoon, barely eating one bite before he noticed. The spoon clattered to the ground, parfait splattering across the floor. He barely noticed. There, on the middle of his shoddy mattress, was a single rose.